One at Condorcet paradox. You'd think that when every person in a group has a clear set of preferences, a single best choice would pop out naturally. Yet the Condorcet paradox reveals that this process can spin in circles even if each individual's ranking is perfectly logical on its own. Picture three coworkers trying to decide where to have lunch. Sam prefers restaurant A over B, and B over C. Priya likes B most, then C, then A. Jacob ranks C first, and B last. At first glance, nothing about these lists seems strange. But when you compare the restaurants in head-to-head matchups, Restaurant A beats Restaurant B, Sam and Jacob side with A. Restaurant B tops Restaurant C, Sam and Priya support B. And then, surprisingly, Restaurant C defeats Restaurant A, Jacob and Priya back C. This leaves us stuck in a loop. A beats B, B beats C, yet C beats A, so there's no single place that wins across all pairwise comparisons. It's a lot like rock, paper, scissors, where each choice can win against one option but lose against another, ensuring no one champion dominates all matchups. The bewildering part is that each coworker's personal ranking is perfectly logical, yet adding them up creates an inconsistent group preference. In actual voting scenarios, this paradox can cause election results to look contradictory. A candidate might beat one rival and lose to another, who is in turn beaten by the first. Designing a voting rule that consistently avoids this cyclical chaos is extremely challenging, which is why many election methods carry the risk of producing outcomes that defy common sense. By grappling with the Condorcet paradox, we grasp that even when individuals act rationally, the group's collective decision may not be straightforward. This paradox highlights the broader theme that fairness in group decisions can be much more complex than it appears on the surface. Ultimately, it warns us that a perfect method for translating personal preferences into a unanimous, best choice may not exist, forcing us to accept trade-offs or settle for imperfect systems. 2. At Arrow's impossibility theorem. Anyone might assume that if we just set up the right rules, like treating each ballot equally and respecting everyone's top choice, we could arrive at the fairest possible outcome. Arrow's impossibility theorem defies that hopeful intuition by proving there's no single voting method that satisfies all the basic fairness criteria we hold dear. Imagine a neighborhood committee choosing an improvement project. Each person ranks a set of proposals, and you'd like a system that respects majority wishes, prevents a single voter from dictating the outcome, and stays consistent if a less popular alternative drops out. Arrow's theorem insists that no matter how we design the rules, one of these ideals must fall through in at least one scenario. It's a bit like trying to bake a dessert that's sugar-free, fat-free, gluten-free, and still tastes fantastic. Fulfilling one requirement can break another. If you guarantee everyone's favorite choice is treated strongly, you risk enabling strategic voters to manipulate the tally. If you block manipulation, you might ignore the intensity of people's preferences. This built-in tension explains why every voting system has drawbacks and can lead to unexpected results. In real elections, it's the reason some methods fail to select a candidate who actually wins most head-to-head matchups, or why others inadvertently encourage strategic voting. Arrow's insight isn't just an academic puzzle. It tells us that each system we adopt must compromise on something. Some prioritize simplicity, others fairness for smaller factions, and still others the ability to reflect strong majorities. By recognizing this theorem, we learn there's no golden rule that magically satisfies all our notions of fair, and that debate over electoral reform isn't about finding perfection but rather about deciding which imperfections are most tolerable. Arrow's impossibility theorem ultimately reminds us that no matter how much we tweak the rules, democracy is inherently about trade-offs, a humbling reality that forces us to think hard about which principles we value most. 3. The Gibbard-Satterthwaite paradox. It may look like plain common sense that the best way to find a group's true preference is to have everyone vote for what they genuinely want. But the Gibbard-Satterthwaite paradox shows that sincerity can be undercut by strategic ploys. Picture a town council debating 3 proposals for a new park. Call them Plan X, Plan Y, and Plan Z. Each council member might have an honest ranking. Maybe one loves C, prefers Y next, and likes X least. But if that council member fears a direct duel between X and Z would lead to X winning, an outcome they dread, they might mark Y as their top choice to block X, effectively sacrificing what they truly want. It's like pretending you like a dish on the menu more than your actual favorite just to stop someone else from ordering a meal you really dislike. Gibbard, Satterthwaite proves that with 3 or more options, no voting method can fully eliminate the incentive for such manipulation. Even a carefully crafted system can't make honesty the best strategy for everyone all the time. It matters because once people know that misleading ballots might secure a more favorable result, many feel compelled to play the same game, creating a spiral of suspicion. Much like a chess match where each player tries to anticipate the other's next move, real elections can devolve into strategic showdowns rather than reflections of genuine opinion. The paradox isn't merely theoretical. It explains why many of us have voted for a second-best candidate to prevent a perceived worse choice from winning. In short, no matter how we arrange the voting process, whether it's ranked choice, approval voting, or something else, there's no absolute guarantee that sincerity triumphs over strategy. Understanding this paradox underscores the complexity of designing a fair electoral system and why every method is subject to strategic distortions. Ultimately, Gibbard, Satterthwaite reminds us that no matter how good our intentions, the lure of gaming the rules can always creep in when multiple viable contenders are on the table. For that no-show paradox, it might sound perfectly logical that the more people vote for something, the better its chances should be. Yet the no-show paradox throws a wrench in that idea by revealing scenarios where casting your ballot can actually spoil your own preferred outcome. Visualize a club choosing a style for its annual banquet. Options A, B, and C are on the table, and you feel passionately that A is the best fit. Under certain voting systems, however, showing up and marking A as your top choice can cause an unforeseen shift in the tally that benefits B or C. It could be that A gets grouped with too many ballots in an early counting stage, triggering a rule that redistributes votes in a way that eliminates a prematurely or boosts a rival. Strangely, if you and other A supporters had stayed home, the counting might have unfolded differently, letting us slip through a critical runoff or pass a viability threshold. It's akin to cheering for your favorite sports team at a packed stadium, only to discover your added presence changes the dynamic in a way that leads them to lose. The paradox highlights that simply having more votes doesn't always help in systems where sequential eliminations, quotas, or tie-break scenarios create delicate balancing acts. Although it runs counter to the core democratic idea that turnout is always good, this phenomenon forces us to admit that certain rules can backfire, penalizing enthusiastic supporters. By grappling with the no-show paradox, we see how even our basic assumptions, like more votes equals better odds, don't always hold up in the realm of collective decision-making. It's a reminder that whenever we design an election process, we have to account for odd quirks that might arise, ensuring that no voter ends up cursing their own participation in an outcome they never wanted. Ultimately, it serves as a cautionary tale. How we count votes can matter as much as, or more than, how many votes any option actually receives. 5. Participation paradox. You'd think an election becomes more representative if more people join in. Yet the participation paradox uncovers how inviting additional voters sometimes flips a previously favored option on its head. Imagine a neighborhood deciding whether to build a community garden or open a small fitness center. First, with only a few residents voting, the garden has a narrow edge. Encouraged by civic groups, more neighbors show up to cast ballots, presumably strengthening the democratic process. But now, thanks to a complex elimination rule or the way preferences are ranked, the surge in voters inadvertently pushes the fitness center into the lead. It's reminiscent of a pickup basketball game where adding one more player completely changes the team dynamic, leading to confusion and mishaps instead of a stronger squad. This paradox might arise in methods that recalculate thresholds or reorder candidates standing when turnout shifts significantly. Instead of ensuring the garden's success, the influx of voters might give just enough first-place votes to a third choice, which then redistributes in a way that favors the fitness center. That means an option originally preferred by the smaller electorate loses once more people participate. The result challenges the naive assumption that higher turnout straightforwardly yields outcomes closer to the majority's wish. By highlighting how voting systems handle new ballots, whether they re-trigger eliminations, reallocate preferences, or set a new viability benchmark, the participation paradox underscores a fundamental tension in democracy. Boosting engagement can occasionally warp the final decision instead of clarifying it. Recognizing this phenomenon pushes us to scrutinize the exact mechanisms behind any election method, so that every vote cast truly helps reflect the electorate's genuine desires. Ultimately, the paradox warns us that including more voices isn't always a foolproof path to fairer results, and that thoughtful design is necessary if we want participation to strengthen, rather than undermine, consensus. Monotonicity paradox, paradox number 6. Sometimes, giving more support to a candidate can surprisingly cause them to lose, which goes against everything we assume about fair voting. Imagine a student council election where a few people decide to bump a certain candidate higher on their ballots, believing this added support will help. In a typical scenario, more votes should only boost a candidate's standing, but under certain voting rules, this added enthusiasm shifts the count in ways that unintentionally allow another candidate to slip ahead. It's similar to adding more air into one side of a balloon. You expect it to inflate evenly, but you might end up causing an odd bulge that pushes air elsewhere, changing the balloon's shape in an unexpected way. Perhaps the system eliminates or redistributes votes in different rounds, and these new rankings alter the flow of transfers enough that a once leading candidate gets knocked out early. This is the crux of the monotonicity paradox. A voting method can punish a candidate just for climbing higher in some voters' rankings, which seems counter to the idea of rewarding genuine support. Real-life elections don't often advertise this possibility, but it can show up in complex systems like instant runoff voting if the rules are set in a particular way. Understanding the monotonicity paradox matters because it highlights a disturbing flaw that undermines the confidence people might have in straightforward notions of more support equals better chances. If a system can fail that simple principle, it raises questions about transparency and fairness. Ultimately, this paradox reminds us that even the best-intentioned voting rules can produce head-scratching outcomes, urging us to think carefully about how votes are tallied and whether minor tweaks in preference should be able to overturn a candidate's hopes of winning. Recognizing this vulnerability is important for any group decision where ranking and elimination may occur, underscoring the delicate nature of designing voting processes that truly reflect what voters want. Favorite betrayal paradox, paradox number 7. There are times when you'd think voting for your absolute favorite should never backfire. Yet the favorite betrayal paradox reveals a situation where it might be wiser to rank someone else on top. Consider a travel club choosing between 3 destinations: a luxurious beach resort, a bustling city tour, and a peaceful mountain retreat. If enough members fear the beach resort might lose to the city tour, they could decide to drop it in their rankings, even though they actually prefer the beach more than anything else. They do this to give the mountain retreat a fighting chance against the city, hoping to avoid a final showdown where the city beats the beach. The strategy, while seemingly backward, could protect them from an outcome they dislike. It's like secretly hoping a friend doesn't pick your real favorite restaurant for dinner, because you suspect another friend's choice might beat it, leaving you stuck with an even less appealing option. The paradox surfaces when the system encourages voters to betray their first choice in order to steer the result away from a dreaded alternative. What makes this particularly unsettling is that it undermines the idea that your favorite should always get your top vote. Knowing the favorite betrayal paradox can happen means realizing that some voting methods push people toward twisted strategies, complicating the very premise of honest representation. In essence, it warns us that even when everyone's preferences are sincere, the way votes are counted can tempt people to distort those preferences just to avoid an unhappy ending. Awareness of this paradox is crucial because it highlights how the design of an election can shape whether voters feel safe revealing what they truly want. Reversal paradox, paradox number 8. Many of us expect that if everyone reversed their rankings, choosing their last place as their first and so on, the outcome would simply flip as well. But the reversal paradox shows that isn't guaranteed. Imagine a group trying to rank 3 different meals for a company luncheon: Meal X, Meal Y, and Meal Z. Under normal preferences, perhaps Meal X comes out on top. Now imagine everyone completely reverses their list, so that their favorite becomes their least liked, and their former least liked becomes their new top choice. Intuition says this should hand victory to the meal that used to lose. However, certain voting methods can produce a head-scratching twist, where the same meal wins again or a different result emerges that doesn't mirror the original outcome. It's akin to playing a board game where reversing every instruction doesn't merely undo your progress, it can create new paths or block old ones in ways you never expected. The reversal paradox matters because it undercuts the idea that voting results should behave in a straightforward, consistent manner. If reversing preferences yields something entirely unexpected, it indicates that the voting system's mechanics aren't as transparent as they might seem. This unpredictability can be unsettling in high-stakes decisions where we count on a method to reflect voters' genuine choices. Ultimately, recognizing the reversal paradox means understanding that even the most natural assumptions, like expecting the opposite rankings to produce the opposite outcome, don't always hold. It reminds us that the rules of an election can have built-in oddities that demand a closer look, ensuring we don't rely solely on what we consider common sense. Agenda manipulation paradox, paradox number 9. Ordering should be neutral, right? Yet the agenda manipulation paradox reminds us that merely changing the sequence in which options are voted on can alter who comes out on top. Visualize a board meeting where several policy proposals are presented one after another. The group starts by comparing proposal A to proposal B. If it wins, it then goes on to challenge proposal C, and the winner there proceeds to face D, and so on. You'd think the final outcome would be the same no matter how the matches are arranged, but if a cunning chairperson rearranges the order of comparisons, they can engineer a path that favors their preferred proposal. It's like arranging a tournament bracket to ensure your favorite team only faces opponents they're likely to beat, sidestepping the toughest competition until the end, or avoiding it entirely. Such manipulation undercuts the idea that the group is collectively deciding on the best proposal from all perspectives. The process becomes more about how the votes are sequenced rather than the intrinsic merits of each option. In real-world scenarios, agenda manipulation can happen in legislative bodies where the order of amendments or bills determines their likelihood of passing. Knowing this paradox exists underscores how fragile outcomes can be if the voting procedure doesn't protect against strategic sequencing. It reminds us that democracy isn't just about letting people voice preferences. It also hinges on ensuring that the order in which issues are presented isn't twisted to guarantee a particular result. Understanding the agenda manipulation paradox encourages more transparent procedures that can withstand any attempts to bend the process in favor of one outcome. Spoiler effect paradox, paradox number 10. Picture a close race between 2 well-established candidates, maybe for a local mayor, and a third, lesser-known contender enters the scene. One might believe this newcomer's presence wouldn't change who ultimately wins, yet the spoiler effect paradox shows that the spoiler can split votes in surprising ways and shift victory to someone else entirely. It's reminiscent of a friend tagging along last minute on a road trip, causing changes in the seating arrangement that spark arguments or resentments, ultimately appending the smooth journey you expected. In a voting context, maybe candidate A and candidate B are nearly tied, but candidate C, who aligns more closely with A, pulls away just enough votes to allow B to squeak by with a plurality. The result is that C has no real chance of winning and instead simply spoils the race for their ideological neighbor. This paradox highlights the vulnerability of certain systems, particularly plurality or first-past-the-post voting, where a minor candidate can disrupt an election without benefiting themselves. It exposes the importance of vote allocation methods that factor in second choices or preference rankings, so an additional candidate doesn't accidentally sabotage the main competition. Understanding the spoiler effect matters because it points out a real flaw in how we handle elections. A single new entry can change the entire dynamic, making the final outcome feel less like the true will of the electorate. By grappling with this paradox, we appreciate why some systems try to minimize the spoiler risk, and why even well-meaning candidates can harm the very causes they represent just by running. Clone candidate paradox, paradox number 11. Consider an election where a strong candidate is suddenly joined by a nearly identical rival, someone who shares their stance on almost every issue. One might assume that having two similar choices would help that group's broader message gain more overall support. Yet the clone candidate paradox often causes them to split the vote instead. It's like running a pizzeria in town and then having a nearly identical pizza place open right next door. You'd assume you both collectively attract more pizza lovers, but in reality, you might just cannibalize each other's customers. In a voting scenario, these clone candidates compete for the same pool of voters, potentially allowing a very different third candidate to rise above them. While you might think the presence of an ally would bolster the original candidate's chances, it can backfire and pave the way for a less similar contender to win. Understanding this paradox is crucial because it explains why strategic candidates sometimes avoid running at all if they're too much like an existing frontrunner. It also shows the weakness in systems that don't let voters rank or score multiple options, forcing them to choose a single favorite. The clone candidate paradox reveals that an election's outcome can hinge on small shifts in how support is divided, rather than the actual strengths of the candidates. In essence, it demonstrates how certain voting methods may penalize diversity of choice, sometimes leaving the electorate with a winner who doesn't really represent the majority's overall preferences. Consistency paradox, paradox number 12. It's tempting to believe that if one candidate wins in separate regions or groups, that same candidate should also win when those groups are combined. But the consistency paradox shows that's not always guaranteed. Picture a national recipe contest, where in the West region, a lasagna dish narrowly beats a taco plate, while in the East region, lasagna also ekes out a victory over tacos. You'd think that combining all votes nationwide would confirm lasagna as the overall winner. But some voting systems might merge and redistribute preferences in such a way that tacos suddenly emerge on top in the final tally. It's like merging two puzzle boards you solved individually, only to find the final combined puzzle doesn't line up the way you expected. Perhaps each region had different second or third choices that come into play once the votes are pooled, flipping the result unexpectedly. The consistency paradox matters because it challenges a core expectation of fairness, that a candidate, or choice, winning in multiple sub-elections should also win the united contest. Failing this test raises questions about how well the method reflects the will of the combined electorate. It highlights the surprising complexities of aggregating preferences and underscores why designing a simple, foolproof voting system is so difficult. If a system isn't consistent, it might undercut public trust, because people naturally assume that a choice favored in multiple smaller elections should hold up when everyone comes together. Recognizing this paradox helps us understand one of the many ways that group decision processes can deviate from basic intuitive logic. Condorcet loser paradox, paradox number 13. You'd expect a candidate who loses in every head-to-head matchup to be the least likely winner. Yet the Condorcet loser paradox reveals that this same candidate can sometimes triumph under certain voting rules. Suppose there's a mayoral race with 4 candidates, and one of them, candidate D, would lose if put directly against any of the others in a one-on-one comparison. Despite that dismal one-on-one record, the election's counting method might eliminate stronger contenders in early rounds based on particular ranking distributions, or it might combine votes in such a convoluted way that D ends up winning overall. It's akin to watching a sports team that can't beat any competitor outright but still somehow advances through the bracket because of technicalities and matchups that favor it at crucial moments. The mere possibility of a Condorcet loser taking the prize feels counterintuitive because it contradicts the common-sense notion that if every other candidate can beat you in a direct contest, you shouldn't come out on top. But some methods, especially those involving sequential elimination or unusual transfers, can create a path to victory for the overall weakest candidate. Understanding this paradox matters because it reveals just how disconnected group decision outcomes can become from straightforward head-to-head logic. It's a jarring reminder that voting rules have loopholes through which unlikely winners can slip, raising concerns about how truly representative any final choice is of the electorate's desires. In other words, it highlights another reason why election design isn't as simple as it might look. Insincere voting paradox, paradox number 14. Most of us would hope that everyone simply votes for what they truly believe in, yet the insincere voting paradox shows that sometimes lying on the ballot can seem more advantageous. Imagine a group of college students trying to pick a date for a big party, with a few possible weekends on the table. You'd think each person would just pick their genuinely preferred weekend. But some might notice that revealing their true preference helps an option they really don't want to gain traction, so they pretend to like a safer alternative. Perhaps they think their first choice is too far-fetched, so backing the second choice is the only way to stop the least favorite from winning. It's like cheering for a rival sports team in a tournament because it's the lesser of two evils if you believe your favorite has no chance. This insincerity creates a distorted reflection of the group's actual preferences and can lead to an outcome that isn't really anyone's top choice. The paradox emerges when voting rules give an opening for strategic misrepresentation to produce a more personally favorable result than honest disclosure would. This is troubling for obvious reasons. If everyone is playing mind games, it becomes nearly impossible to figure out the group's real wishes. By studying the insincere voting paradox, we see how some systems practically invite manipulation, pushing individuals to think less about their true preferences and more about how their ballot influences the overall result. It's a reminder that democracy can sometimes get tangled up in strategy, and honest expression might fall by the wayside. Strategic abstention paradox, paradox number 15. You'd assume casting your ballot is always better than staying on the sidelines, but the strategic abstention paradox proves there are moments when sitting out can actually improve the final outcome you want. Think of a neighborhood choosing between 3 garbage collection plans, each with different costs and benefits. If you and your friends favor Plan A, you might believe it's wise to show up in force, marking it as your top choice. But under certain voting methods, the extra votes for A or the way they interact with second and third preferences can eliminate a friendly alternative plan early, clearing the path for a plan you really dislike. By not voting, you might keep the dynamics in balance so that your least favorite plan gets knocked out first, giving A better shot in the final rounds. It sounds odd, but it's somewhat like an auction where bidding aggressively might drive up the final price, so holding back can yield a better deal. In the context of elections, strategic abstention undercuts the usual assumption that more participation automatically means a fairer reflection of everyone's wishes. This paradox matters because it undermines the standard civic message that every single vote is always crucial. If the rules allow a group to better achieve its desired outcome by not voting, that's a sign the system might inadvertently reward lower turnout in certain scenarios. Understanding this possibility is important for designers of voting systems, as it shows how easily well-intentioned approaches can end up discouraging participation rather than encouraging it, complicating the goal of truly representative decision-making. Redistribution paradox, paradox number 16. Sometimes, a voting system aims to ensure that no vote is wasted by transferring ballots from losing candidates to the voters' next choices. But the redistribution paradox reveals how these well-intentioned shifts can lead to results that appear upside down. Imagine a local election with 4 candidates, where voters list them in order of preference, and whenever a candidate is eliminated, their supporters' ballots are passed on to the next preferred option still in the race. At first glance, this might seem like a fair way to keep everyone's voice relevant. However, the final outcome can be swayed in surprising ways by how and when these transfers occur. Suppose a relatively popular candidate barely escapes elimination in the early rounds, forcing another, slightly less popular candidate out instead. All the votes from that second candidate then transfer to someone who was initially in third place, catapulting them far above the first candidate in a subsequent round. In this strange twist, the final winner might end up being a person who, if you compared them head-to-head with others at the start, wouldn't have fared as well. It's like trying to organize your closet by moving clothes around. You think you're creating a more efficient layout, but items can end up in places that don't make practical sense, and you lose track of what you meant to keep front and center. The redistribution paradox matters because it undercuts the assumption that transferring votes automatically makes the election reflect everyone's true preference. People who voted for a popular candidate might even see that popularity backfire if it changes the order of eliminations in a way that helps a less favored contender. By understanding that these transfers can unintentionally boost certain candidates, we see how crucial the specifics of each elimination round really are. In the end, this paradox reminds us that while runoff-style systems can prevent someone from winning with a mere plurality, they also harbor the potential for baffling upsets. That possibility forces us to question whether complex vote transfers guarantee better overall representation or if they sometimes create more confusion than clarity, ultimately affecting how content voters feel with the final outcome. Dual vulnerability paradox, paradox number 17. It's easy to assume that if a voting system has multiple flaws, they might cancel each other out or at least make manipulation harder. But the dual vulnerability paradox shows these weaknesses can combine in ways that magnify the problem. Envision an election method where one known issue is that you can gain an advantage by undercutting a candidate you secretly dislike, and another separate flaw rewards you for ranking a dark horse contender higher than you honestly would. When both flaws are at play, a crafty group of voters can exploit them in tandem, perhaps by massively downranking the candidate they find threatening while also artificially boosting a candidate they see as harmless, effectively removing the real competitor from the race and paving the way for a more favored choice. It's reminiscent of a situation in a board game where you know two different tricks that break the rules. One allows you to jump ahead on the board, and the other lets you sabotage your rival's token. Used together, these tricks can create a victory path far more powerful than relying on them individually. This dual vulnerability matters because it reveals that fixing just one problem in a voting system doesn't necessarily make it secure if another loophole remains. In fact, once people discover how to combine two or more manipulative tactics, the outcome can become even further removed from the honest preferences of the electorate. Voters who don't play these games might feel disadvantaged or fooled, as if the election were orchestrated behind the scenes by those who understand its pitfalls. Recognizing the dual vulnerability paradox is essential for anyone hoping to design or choose a voting system that remains robust under pressure. It reminds us that vulnerabilities aren't isolated. They can multiply and intertwine, underscoring the importance of a comprehensive approach to preventing manipulation so that the final result genuinely reflects what the majority wants, rather than clever maneuvers by a scheming minority. Majority rule paradox, paradox number 18. Majority rule might sound like the most straightforward principle. If more than half the people want something, that's the outcome. Yet the majority rule paradox highlights that simply gathering over 50% of the votes doesn't guarantee a decision that makes sense for everyone, especially when you look at the intensity of preferences or how different choices might interact. Imagine a scenario with three policy proposals, B and C, where 51% strongly favors A, but 49% feels extremely opposed to A and only mildly opposed to B or C. Even though A wins outright by majority, that victory could create lingering resentment among nearly half the electorate, who might have accepted B or C as a less painful compromise. It's a bit like choosing dinner plans by simple vote. If 5 out of 9 friends adore spicy food and the other 4 have a severe allergy, that majority wins, but the minority is left with a miserable or even harmful experience. In multi-issue or multi-candidate elections, the paradox can deepen, revealing that majoritarian systems sometimes ignore how strongly or weakly people feel about a choice, focusing only on the raw count of supporters. Understanding this problem is important because many democratic frameworks rely on the premise that more votes equals the correct outcome, without considering how intensities of preference or complex alliances might factor in. By bringing attention to the majority rule paradox, we see why some systems experiment with supermajorities, rank ballots, or other structures that try to capture more nuance. It doesn't mean majority rule is inherently flawed, but rather that it can produce outcomes many view as unfair or polarizing if a large minority feels deeply alienated. Recognizing this gap helps us appreciate why the search continues for voting methods that balance majority power with broader acceptance. ensuring that decisions aren't simply about hitting the 50% mark but also about fostering genuine support among as many people as possible. Minimal manipulation paradox, paradox number 19. There's a reassuring idea that small acts of strategic voting can't drastically reshape an election's outcome. But the minimal manipulation paradox shows that even subtle tweaks can alter who wins. Picture a city council race where one candidate, Callum, has strong initial support, but a small faction of voters dislikes him enough to consider manipulating their rankings. Maybe these voters downgrade Callum by one notch on their ballots or slightly boost a rival candidate they find tolerable. At first glance, this might seem inconsequential, just a minor preference shift. Yet in a system that eliminates candidates round by round or redistributes votes, that tiny adjustment could cause Callum to fall behind at a crucial stage, allowing someone else to slide into the final matchup and ultimately claim victory. It's akin to tilting a pinball machine just a little, causing the ball to take a different path that racks up points for another player. The paradox underscores how sensitive some voting methods are to the slightest changes in how people rank or cast their votes. This subtlety can feel unfair, as though a handful of strategically clever ballots manage to hijack the collective will of the majority. It also raises questions about whether a system should be robust enough to withstand these minimal manipulations. If a candidate truly is favored by most people, shouldn't they remain on top unless there's a widespread shift in support? Confronting the minimal manipulation paradox is important for designers of voting rules because it highlights how a handful of strategic ballots might produce disproportionate outcomes. It's a reminder that elections can be shaped by just a few cunning individuals who understand how to exploit tiny openings in the rules, and that trusting the system to reflect one person, one vote, can be more complicated than it sounds. Boundary paradox, paradox number 20. Reconfiguring voting districts seems like a purely administrative act. After all, you haven't changed anyone's political beliefs, yet the boundary paradox reveals that redrawing lines on a map can flip entire election results. Picture a region with a near-even split between two major parties, Party X and Party Y. If the district boundaries are arranged in one way, Party X might win 3 out of 5 districts, but if you shift the lines by just a few blocks, Party Y could pick up enough voters to flip 2 of those districts, suddenly coming out on top. It's reminiscent of rearranging the seats in a theater. The audience members are the same, but by placing them differently, the show's atmosphere and overall tone can feel drastically altered. This paradox matters because it challenges the common assumption that election outcomes reflect only voter preferences, when in reality, how we slice and group populations has a direct impact on who ends up with representation. Gerrymandering is a notorious real-world example of this problem. Politicians can carefully craft boundaries to cluster or disperse certain types of voters, all without changing a single mind or policy stance. Recognizing the boundary paradox is crucial for anyone who values fair representation. Even if everyone's votes are cast honestly, the way those votes are aggregated into districts can distort the final distribution of seats. It underlines the idea that democracy is not just about the act of voting itself, but also about how we define communities of interest, how we count votes, and who gets grouped together. In the end, it serves as a reminder that a seemingly neutral process, drawing lines, can be weaponized to produce results that may not reflect the true balance of support across a region, raising hard questions about what fairness really means. Participation disincentive paradox, paradox number 21. While many view high voter turnout as a hallmark of a healthy democracy, the participation disincentive paradox shows that, in certain systems, some groups might realize they should stay home if they want their preferred outcome to prevail. Imagine a union election with multiple competing proposals for a benefits package. You'd expect union leaders to urge all members to vote. However, under certain methods, perhaps one that counts only first preference votes before eliminating the weakest option, a flood of new participants might ironically boost a compromise proposal, even though the majority strongly favors a more generous plan. If some voters strategically sit out, the favored plan might face less immediate competition and sail to victory. It's a bit like a basketball team that intentionally benches a few of its decent players during qualifiers to avoid facing a powerhouse rival too soon in the tournament bracket, giving them a cleaner path to the final. This scenario runs counter to the usual assumption that more voices lead to more legitimate results. Instead, it prompts the uncomfortable realization that certain election rules can reward absences by recalibrating vote distributions in a way that benefits those who abstain. The participation disincentive paradox matters because it highlights an unsettling effect. The rules of some voting systems might discourage the very engagement they're supposed to encourage. Recognizing this helps us see why people might be wary of all-or-nothing mobilization, especially if they believe showing up in large numbers will alter the delicate balance that keeps their preferred option safe. Ultimately, it challenges the idea that democracy is always best served by maximizing voter participation, nudging us to question if certain procedures inadvertently make less participation the more strategic move. Reverse Borda paradox. Paradox number 22. At first glance, the Borda count seems straightforward. Rank your choices, and your top picks earn more points than your lower picks. Yet the reverse Borda paradox demonstrates that if everyone flipped their preferences completely, it wouldn't necessarily flip the final outcome in a clean mirror image. Imagine a contest to choose a theme for a corporate event, with masquerade, beach party, and roaring 20s as the options. In a normal Borda scenario, maybe beach party collects enough mid and high-level rankings to win, while the other two split the first-place spots among passionate supporters. If all employees invert their ballots so that their last-place choice becomes first, you might expect beach party to drop to the bottom. But the actual result can turn out differently because Borda awards points based on position. Suddenly, masquerade, or roaring 20s, might shoot up due to how these inverted scores get tallied, but it's not guaranteed that the original winner becomes the definitive loser. It's similar to reversing the direction of every street in a city. You might think the traffic flow would just go the opposite way, but the actual congestion patterns could become chaotic and unpredictable. Understanding the reverse Borda paradox is important because it reveals the inherent asymmetry in how certain scoring systems handle preferences. Even a seemingly minor alteration, everyone deciding to invert their votes, can trigger a result that doesn't match our intuitive sense of a simple flip. That lesson underscores the broader point. Voting rules are rarely as linear or reversible as they may appear, and real-world outcomes can bend in unexpected ways when collective preferences shift, even if they shift in the exact opposite direction. Borda count paradox. Paradox number 23. Giving each ranking position a certain point value sounds fair enough. But the Borda count paradox shows that a candidate who appears second or third on almost everyone's ballot can lose to one who's first for a small faction but last for everyone else. Imagine a mayoral race with 4 candidates: Alice, Bob, Carol, and Dan. Perhaps Bob is consistently a pretty good second choice for the majority, while Alice and Carol each have a dedicated, smaller group of voters who rank them as number 1 and rank Bob near the bottom. Under the Borda scoring system, those first-place rankings can net Alice or Carol a hefty amount of points, potentially overshadowing Bob's broad but moderate support. It's like a band competition where one group receives several perfect scores from a few judges who adore them, while another group receives mostly solid, but not outstanding, scores from every judge. Those perfect 10s might carry more weight than a bunch of 7s or 8s. In fact, the Borda count might crown a more polarizing candidate, ignoring the candidate who's everyone's safe bet. This paradox is pivotal because it highlights how a method designed to acknowledge all levels of preference can still produce outcomes that fail to capture the true middle ground choice. For voters who believe in compromise or who want a candidate capable of uniting diverse interests, the Borda count paradox poses a serious puzzle. Why should a candidate with widespread, if subdued, support lose to someone a minority passionately loves but a majority genuinely dislikes? Coming to terms with this question is a key step in assessing whether we value intense support or broad acceptability more in our electoral systems, and it reveals just how tricky that trade-off can become. Hare-Clark paradox. Paradox number 24. Some hail the Hare-Clark method, a variation of ranked choice voting used in places like Australia, as a more representative way to choose multiple winners. But the Hare-Clark paradox arises when slight changes in the order of candidate elimination lead to glaringly different results. Suppose a city is electing a council of 5 members, and each voter lists all candidates by preference. When the votes are counted, the lowest polling candidate gets removed, and their votes transfer to each supporter's next choice. This process repeats until the final seats are filled. You'd expect the end result to be consistent no matter how you slice it, but if one candidate is eliminated a bit earlier or later, it can drastically change who inherits their votes. Imagine a candidate who might have been saved by a slim margin in one tally, collecting enough transfers from another candidate's elimination to suddenly catapult into a winning seat. Meanwhile, in a slightly different scenario, they get knocked out first, and those same votes end up going to someone else, potentially rearranging the entire lineup. It's like changing the batting order in baseball. The same players face the same pitchers, but the timing of each matchup can swing the score. This paradox is significant because it challenges the assumption that a multi-winner ranked system will always yield a stable, intuitive set of winners. If a method meant to reflect nuanced preferences can be appended by modest shifts in who gets removed first, it raises questions about how well it truly captures the electorate's will. In essence, the Hare-Clark paradox underscores that not even carefully structured systems are immune to curious anomalies, and that minor differences in vote counts can produce major shifts in how the final seats are distributed. Single transferable vote, STV. Paradox number 25. Aiming to ensure that every vote counts. Single transferable vote, STV. Lets voters rank their choices and keeps redistributing ballots from winning or eliminated candidates until all seats are filled. Yet the STV paradox occurs when these transfers generate results that don't match the broader sentiment. Picture a scenario where one candidate soars past the quota early, causing their surplus votes to be reallocated. In theory, that might spread support to like-minded candidates, but the precise formula for redistributing surpluses can lead to odd twists. Maybe a candidate who is second favorite for many gets fewer of those surplus ballots than expected because of rounding rules or because some ballots had that candidate in third place. Meanwhile, a more polarizing contender scoops up a bigger chunk of the surplus, eventually overtaking the consensus candidate. It's comparable to splitting a pot of prize money among several winners. The fraction each person receives can end up feeling random if the method for dividing the pot doesn't account for all nuances in how people contributed. STV is often lauded for its fairness in proportional representation, but this paradox reveals that the fine print matters. Small details in how surpluses are allocated can reshape the final roster of winners, sometimes delivering surprises that aren't obviously aligned with overall voter intention. Recognizing the STV paradox is vital for communities choosing to adopt or refine this system, as it clarifies that no voting method is without quirks. Even one built to handle complex preferences can misfire if the mechanisms for transferring surplus votes or eliminating candidates inadvertently favor certain contenders, reminding us once more that the path from individual rankings to group decisions can contain unexpected detours. Majority judgment paradox. Paradox number 26. Plenty of people believe that asking voters to rate each candidate on a scale is a great way to capture overall impressions. Yet the majority judgment paradox shows that even this seemingly fair method can yield perplexing outcomes. In majority judgment, each candidate's final score is based on their median rating, which aims to reflect the typical voter's view rather than just adding up points. Suppose 3 candidates run for office, and voters rate them on a simple scale, like poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. One candidate might earn a lot of mid-level ratings, say good, across most ballots, whereas another candidate has half of the voters giving them a top rating, excellent, and half giving them very low marks, poor. You'd expect the broadly liked candidate to win outright, but if the polarized candidate manages just enough excellent ratings so that their median nudges higher than good, they can overtake the more consistently approved candidate. It's like grading a group project where a few classmates believe the work is spectacular and a few hate it, so the final verdict might end up stronger than that of a project everyone considered above average. but not amazing. Understanding the majority judgment paradox matters because it reveals that even carefully crafted rating systems can favor candidates with pockets of intense support over those who are quietly appreciated by many. This prompts questions about how best to weigh different levels of enthusiasm versus widespread moderate approval, reminding us that every voting system carries unexpected twists and trade-offs when transforming individual judgments into one collective decision. Score voting paradox. Paradox number 27. Some argue that letting people score each candidate independently, like rating them from 0 to 10, offers a more nuanced snapshot of public opinion. Yet the score voting paradox emerges when these independent scores produce a winner whose overall, average, appeal defies common intuition. Imagine a scenario with 3 candidates. Candidate A, broadly liked by most voters. Candidate B, strongly adored by a small but passionate group, and candidate C, moderately liked by nearly everyone. Voters assign scores to each candidate, meaning they can give A 7, B, and C an 8, for instance, based on how they feel about each. Though A might be the safe bet for a majority, B could still triumph if that niche group rates B extremely high and the rest of the electorate merely gives B a middling score rather than a very low one. It's akin to a product review site where a dedicated fan base floods it with perfect reviews, pushing the overall rating above a competitor product that gets mostly solid but not stellar feedback. This paradox signals that while score voting can capture more nuance than a simple rank or single vote, it can also amplify vocal minorities who bestow near maximal points while others remain lukewarm, potentially overshadowing a candidate who might actually be the overall consensus pick. Recognizing this dynamic forces us to ask whether the final outcome in a score voting system truly reflects the will of the people, or if it skews toward those who inspire intense admiration in some and mild approval from others. Pareto improvement paradox. Paradox number 28. It might feel self-evident that if everyone prefers a particular change, the system should adopt it without hesitation. Yet the Pareto improvement paradox shows that some voting methods can block a unanimously desired shift. Picture a committee that has settled on a policy through their established voting rules, only to realize afterward that an alternative tweak would make every single member of the group better off in some way, or at least not worse off. You'd think that if nobody's losing anything, the group would automatically move toward this improved option. However, certain procedural constraints or thresholds in a voting system might prevent the proposal from even coming to a vote, or might require majorities in multiple rounds that don't form without complex deal-making. It's akin to a team discovering a more efficient workflow that each person likes, but the official rulebook says they can't pivot mid-project without a unanimous preliminary motion, which itself requires a quorum that can't be easily gathered. The paradox matters because it contradicts our assumption that a unanimous preference should always be adopted with ease. Instead, the rules might lock the group into the status quo or make it so cumbersome to adopt changes that even clear improvements don't happen. Understanding this reveals how rigid procedures and built-in hurdles can stand in the way of obvious progress, prompting questions about how to design a voting or decision-making system that remains flexible when genuine consensus arises. In essence, the Pareto improvement paradox highlights the tension between procedural stability and the desire to enact beneficial changes that everyone can support. Inversion paradox. Paradox number 29. It's natural to believe that if one candidate outranks another according to the aggregate of everyone's preferences, the overall outcome should reflect that relationship. Yet the inversion paradox reveals that an election can produce winners who trail behind another contender in pairwise comparisons. Envision a mayoral race with 4 hopefuls, A, B, C, and D. If you tally up how each candidate fares in a head-to-head match against each rival, it might turn out that B beats A, C, and D individually. Intuition says B should be the top choice. However, in certain counting methods, the way votes transfer or the order of eliminations might allow A or even D to slip by and claim victory, despite losing directly to B in a one-on-one face-off. It's similar to watching a tournament where a team that regularly beats its rivals nonetheless gets knocked out in a specific bracket structure, paving the way for an underdog to triumph. The paradox arises when the overall system's logic prioritizes certain steps, like eliminating candidates with the lowest first-choice support over the broader notion of who wins in most matchups. This can feel counterintuitive, as it undercuts the straightforward principle that if you can beat every competitor directly, you deserve the title. Understanding the inversion paradox is critical because it uncovers yet another way that seemingly fair rules can create odd detours on the path to selecting a winner, hinting that how we count votes can matter even more than how people cast them. Dictator paradox. Paradox number 30. Most democracy-minded folks assume that removing a single dictator from the process is always a good thing. But the dictator paradox shows that sometimes, prohibiting a powerful deciding voice can force the system to adopt less obvious quirks and flaws. Imagine a scenario where, to prevent any one person from swaying the outcome, rules are tightened so that every vote must be balanced against others, no matter the intensity of preference. In practice, this could mean you lose some ability to break ties based on who actually cares the most about a particular outcome. It's like cooking a group meal where absolutely no single cook can make a final call, so you end up with a hodgepodge of flavors that nobody truly enjoys, as opposed to letting one expert chef decide a key ingredient for everyone's benefit. The paradox arises in theoretical frameworks like Arrow's impossibility theorem, where we find that banning all forms of single-voter dictatorship can come into conflict with other fairness criteria, forcing trade-offs that might cause cyclical results or create incentives for strategic misrepresentation. Recognizing the dictator paradox is important because it reveals the tension between ensuring no single individual dominates a decision and ensuring other fairness properties remain intact. By examining this, we see how the desire to safeguard against dictatorship can push a voting system toward complex structures that still have their own pitfalls. In the end, it highlights the persistent trade-offs in collective choice, where pushing out one extreme risk can unintentionally invite another. Impossibility aggregation paradox. Paradox number 31. When a group tries to combine individual preferences or judgments into one unified decision, it's tempting to assume that some ingenious formula must exist to make everyone's input mesh perfectly. Yet the impossibility aggregation paradox reminds us that no single method can satisfy all our fairness or rationality demands at once. In many ways, it's a direct echo of deeper results like Arrow's impossibility theorem, but it also arises in other contexts such as opinion pooling, where experts' probability estimates must be aggregated into one collective forecast. Picture a corporate team that needs to predict market trends by blending each member's estimates. You'd hope the combined prediction would be consistent, unbiased, and reflect every person's expertise proportionally. However, constraints arise. If you prioritize reflecting each individual's viewpoint, you might lose consistency when faced with contradictory inputs. If you force consistency, you might suppress minority voices. It's akin to a group puzzle where each participant has pieces that might not fit neatly together, and any attempt to force them might require trimming edges or ignoring pieces altogether. The impossibility aggregation paradox matters because it underlines that certain desirable conditions, like coherence, balance, and inclusivity, can't all be met at once when weaving separate perspectives into one final stance. Realizing this prevents us from chasing a pipe dream of perfect aggregation, prompting a more pragmatic approach where we accept certain trade-offs to build a system that works well enough for most scenarios. Ultimately, it highlights a core truth of decision-making. No matter how hard we try, some element of compromise, imperfection, or loss of detail is bound to creep in. Quota paradox. Paradox number 32. Many people see quota rules as a way to ensure that seat allocation or vote distribution is proportional and fair. Yet the quota paradox arises when strictly following a quota formula yields seat distributions that defy common sense. Picture a legislative body that allots seats to parties based on the share of votes they receive, with a set quota defining how many votes equal one seat. Under methods like the hair or droop quotas, one might expect that a party earning, say, 2.4 quota units would get 2 seats, while a party with 2.6 gets 3, which seems fair at first glance. But the paradox surfaces when rounding and leftover votes can let a party with slightly fewer votes end up with more seats than a party with more votes. purely because of how those remainders are counted. It's a bit like splitting a pie in exact fractions but having slivers of leftover that somehow end up giving a bigger piece to a smaller group. This paradox becomes even sharper when multiple regions or lists are aggregated, further complicating who actually meets or exceeds each quota. Recognizing the quota paradox is crucial for advocates of proportional representation because it challenges the assumption that a neat quota mechanism will translate directly into a balanced seat distribution. Instead, it reveals that math-based rules can create odd distortions at the boundaries, implying that real-world elections can produce seat assignments that frustrate both candidates and voters expecting a one-to-one correspondence between votes and seats. Proportionality paradox, paradox number 33. When you hear the term proportional representation, it suggests an ideal scenario where each group's share of seats perfectly matches its share of votes. Yet the proportionality paradox shows that actual systems striving for this can still yield outcomes people find unfair. Imagine a country using a party list method to allocate parliamentary seats so that, if a party secures 20% of the national vote, it should get around 20% of the seats. That sounds wonderful in theory, but in practice, issues arise around threshold requirements, a minimum percentage to gain any seats at all, and district sizes, which can skew results. For instance, a small party that just misses the threshold might be locked out entirely, leaving its supporters effectively unrepresented, while a slightly larger party gets a windfall of extra seats. It's reminiscent of a dinner bill split among a group of friends. Everyone pays their fair share, but if you didn't buy quite enough to warrant your own meal charge, you might end up not eating at all, even though you contributed money. The paradox arises when these seemingly fair rules collide with real-world distributions of votes, revealing that true proportionality is trickier to nail down than we assume. Understanding this helps us see why some people remain dissatisfied with proportional systems, pointing out that certain design features can tilt the seat count in ways that don't perfectly align with the actual share of votes cast. Ultimately, the proportionality paradox reminds us that even well-meaning attempts to share power exactly can stumble on technicalities, undermining the very fairness they set out to achieve. Partition paradox, paradox number 34. Most would guess that if a candidate or party wins within every part of a divided electorate, they should also win when those parts are combined. Yet the partition paradox demonstrates this isn't always the case. Suppose we split a country into two large regions, East and West, and in each region, Party A ends up securing a majority of votes against Parties B and C. Logically, you'd expect that if we pool East and West, Party A should also come out on top. But depending on the vote distribution and the voting system, combining these separate tallies can twist the outcome so that Party B, or even C, surprisingly captures the national majority. It's somewhat like two different puzzle boards where you solve them separately and each has the same picture on top. Yet when you mix the pieces together, a different picture emerges as dominant. The paradox arises especially in systems that reweight or redistribute votes across multiple stages or use thresholds for seat allocation that shift once parts are merged. Recognizing the partition paradox is key to understanding why group decisions made at separate levels don't always sum up neatly. It challenges the assumption that doing well in smaller subdivisions guarantees overall success, which is a big deal in federal or multi-level electoral processes. In essence, it reminds us that merging results from sub-elections can create paradoxical reversals, suggesting that how we define regions and how we add up votes can drastically influence who ends up governing. Sequential voting paradox, paradox number 35. Plenty of decision-making processes happen in multiple rounds, where votes in one round influence who's still in the running for the next. Yet the sequential voting paradox occurs when the order of these rounds and how choices are pitted against each other can produce results at odds with what the majority might have picked in a single-shot vote. Imagine a committee choosing a new company policy. In the first round, they vote on whether to adopt policy X or proceed to compare other ideas. If X wins, the process ends. If X loses, they move on to examine policy Y, then policy Z, and so forth. Each step eliminates an option or solidifies a winner before the group sees the entire field in one go. It's somewhat like a cooking show where a recipe that might have lost if compared directly to all alternatives manages to shine when evaluated in a particular sequence of tastings. The paradox emerges if a policy gets adopted early on, even though many committee members actually prefer a later policy but never get the chance to compare it head-to-head with the winner. Recognizing this phenomenon is essential for anyone who assumes sequential decision-making is always fair or efficient. It suggests that slight changes in the order of deliberation or the design of each round can completely change who walks away victorious, raising questions about how to ensure that the final choice truly reflects the group's overall priorities. Ultimately, the sequential voting paradox underlines that while breaking decisions into steps might seem more organized, it can also create pathways for unexpected winners who might not hold broad support across the entire electorate. Elimination order paradox, paradox number 36. It might be comforting to think that no matter how candidates are removed in a ranked choice election, the ultimate winner should be the same if everyone's preferences remain constant. Yet the elimination order paradox shows that the sequence in which candidates drop out can drastically alter who eventually comes out on top. Picture a city with 4 contenders running for mayor. In one scenario, the first candidate eliminated is someone with only a small share of first-place votes, so that person's supporters transfer their second choices to another candidate who then survives the next round. This might let a moderate candidate gather momentum, eventually winning. In another scenario, a slightly different counting rule or a marginal shift in tallying causes a different low-polling candidate to be eliminated first, transferring votes in a way that boosts a more extreme contender. By the end, the election's outcome flips, even though nobody changed their actual rankings. It's a bit like building a pyramid where each layer depends on precisely how you stack blocks at the bottom. Alter the foundation just a little, and you might end up with a very different structure on top. Understanding this paradox matters because it reveals that even fair-seeming procedures can hide vulnerabilities. If the order of elimination isn't fixed or can be influenced, strategic players might push for a particular candidate to drop out first. In real-world settings, especially those with multiple rounds or complicated vote transfers, the elimination order can become a powerful tool in shaping the final result. This raises important questions about how to design a system that captures people's preferences without letting the early departure of one candidate totally reshape who wins. When the winner can change just because one candidate was knocked out first instead of second, it suggests that our usual assumptions about ranked voting need a closer look. The elimination order paradox ultimately reminds us that every step in a multi-round process matters and that an outcome might hinge as much on the route we take as on the preferences we start with. Turnout sensitivity paradox, paradox number 37. We often hear that a higher turnout is a victory for democracy, since more voices are heard and the results presumably become more legitimate. The turnout sensitivity paradox challenges this belief by showing that in some voting systems, a slight increase or decrease in participation can flip the winner in counterintuitive ways. Imagine a regional election where 2 main candidates are running neck and neck, with a third minor candidate attracting just a small but dedicated following. If extra voters suddenly show up and lean slightly toward the leading candidate, you'd think that candidate would be further cemented as the winner. Yet in certain ranked or runoff-style methods, these new votes can trigger a redistribution or elimination that elevates the minor candidate enough to change who's still in the running at a critical moment. This might allow the second-place contender to slip into first when all the transfers are done. It's a bit like adding more water to a bathtub only to discover that the overflow mechanism activates, draining the water in a way that leaves the tub even less full than before. The paradox highlights how sensitive some systems are to small changes in participation or preference, complicating the message that every additional vote helps. While democratic principles rightly celebrate high turnout, this paradox forces us to confront the reality that certain election designs can yield outcomes that defy our expectations when more voters appear. In practice, if a party or candidate recognizes this paradox, they might actually discourage borderline supporters from casting a ballot, suspecting that fresh participation could backfire. Such an approach feels undemocratic, Yet it emerges naturally in systems susceptible to the turnout sensitivity paradox. This underscores the importance of scrutinizing how votes are counted, ensuring that an uptick in engagement doesn't inadvertently lead to an unexpected and, for some, unwelcome final result. Strategic nomination paradox, paradox number 38. Common sense might suggest that adding more candidates to a race should simply give voters more options without drastically changing who is most likely to win. However, the strategic nomination paradox demonstrates that in certain systems, introducing a new contender can reshuffle the outcome in surprising ways. Picture a local election where two established candidates are almost evenly matched, and a third, fairly similar candidate jumps in. You'd assume this newcomer either wins if they're truly better or just loses without affecting the main competition. Yet in a system like ranked choice or even a conventional plurality vote, this new face can split the base of the candidate they most resemble, allowing the other candidate, whom the public might not prefer in a head-to-head matchup, to sneak ahead. It's a bit like a track meet where two top runners from the same team both enter a race, accidentally dividing their coach's attention and letting a runner from another team pull off the victory. Strategic actors can exploit this by nominating a candidate with a specific appeal, knowing that doing so disrupts the existing balance. Sometimes they might nominate a dummy candidate or encourage a spoiler campaign precisely because it siphons votes from a rival. This paradox matters because it exposes how, in a real election, the very act of running for office can be weaponized. People might not run to win but to manipulate how the votes are distributed, ultimately altering the outcome for reasons having little to do with genuine popular support. Recognizing the strategic nomination paradox forces us to see the fragility in systems where the set of contenders can be used to shape the final result. Far from being a simple question of the more, the merrier, adding a new candidate can serve as a potent tactic, especially when close races and specific rules for tallying or eliminating candidates make the field vulnerable to precise interference. Non-monotonicity in runoff elections. Paradox number 39. Many people assume that in a two-round or runoff election, helping a candidate gain more support should never harm their chances. Yet, non-monotonic behavior can crop up when the very votes that push someone higher also trigger a change in who they face in the next round, potentially causing them to lose. Imagine a mayoral race with 3 candidates, call them A, B, and C. In round 1, if a score is high enough to face B in the runoff, they might beat B easily. But if some of A's supporters rank A even higher, or simply turn out in greater numbers, that might cause C to get knocked out first instead, leaving A to face an opponent like B in different circumstances, or even C in a new pairing. In that shifted scenario, A might lose because the dynamics of head-to-head matchups play out differently. It's reminiscent of a situation where you try to improve your standing in a tournament bracket, only to realize that by doing so, you face a tougher competitor in the semifinals rather than an easier one you might have beaten. Non-monotonicity means exactly that. Improving your standing doesn't always help you win. This paradox can frustrate both voters and candidates, as it feels deeply counterintuitive to see a candidate punished by receiving more enthusiastic backing. It also raises questions about whether runoff systems truly reward broad support or if they can fall victim to intricate preference distributions and elimination procedures. Recognizing non-monotonicity in runoffs highlights the fact that even supposedly simple two-round methods can harbor surprising traps, especially in contests where 3 or more contestants begin the race. Ultimately, this phenomenon is a reminder that small changes in vote distribution can produce big twists in who makes it through each round. Redistribution of preferences paradox. Paradox number 40. When faced with multiple candidates, some voting systems use iterative rounds of tallying, eliminating the lowest scoring candidate each time, and distributing their supporters' preferences among those left. While this feels fair in theory, the redistribution of preferences paradox happens when moving ballots around in these steps yields an outcome that seems to contradict the overall sentiment of the electorate. Picture an election where a moderate candidate, D, initially does well enough not to be eliminated, but not quite well enough to surpass 2 other rivals, E and F. In one specific elimination order, E drops out first, and E's votes mostly shift to D, allowing D to overtake F in the final round. In another scenario with a minor tweak, like a small increase in votes for D or E, the initial elimination might target a different contender, sending that contender's votes to F instead, suddenly giving F a commanding lead. It's like rearranging furniture in a house to make better use of space, only to discover that each time you move one piece, it changes the entire traffic flow, either freeing up or clogging areas in unexpected ways. The paradox reveals how reliant the final result can be on the precise path of vote transfers and how a seemingly winning candidate can vanish from contention if the votes get redistributed in another sequence. It matters because it underscores that some runoff or ranked methods can produce contradictory outcomes without any voter actually changing their fundamental preferences, only the way those preferences are processed. By understanding this, we see that while redistribution promises a second or third chance for votes, it also opens the door to complicated chain reactions that might not always reflect what the group collectively desires. Consensus paradox, paradox number 41. Many teams or organizations dream of reaching a consensus that truly satisfies everyone, thinking that if they keep talking and narrowing down options, they'll find a choice everyone at least accepts, if not loves. But the consensus paradox arises when that patient process of boiling down the group's preferences results in a final decision that doesn't genuinely reflect any strong support. Imagine colleagues trying to pick a conference venue. They spend hours discussing each possibility, eliminating the ones some people strongly oppose, then dropping others that are too expensive, and so on. Eventually, they're left with a venue that gets a lukewarm nod from almost everyone, but in truth, nobody is excited about it, and some might secretly prefer a previously discarded option. It's like trying to make a pot of soup where you remove every ingredient that anyone finds disagreeable, only to end up with bland broth. In real-world voting or consensus building, this can emerge as a scenario where the final consensus is something that never would have won a direct vote had it been up against more passionately supported alternatives. This phenomenon points to the trade-off between avoiding intense objection and fostering true endorsement. When the process is so fixated on removing every source of conflict, it can silence potentially more inspiring choices that spark disagreement but also real enthusiasm. Recognizing the consensus paradox matters because it shows that aiming for universal agreement can lead to outcomes that are too watered down to represent the dynamic interests of a group. Instead of highlighting the best solution, consensus building might deliver the least offensive one, prompting a debate about whether the smoothest choice is always better than a more contentious but potentially transformative option. Tactical voting paradox, paradox number 42. It seems logical to assume that if we want the most authentic outcome, everyone should vote sincerely, ranking their true preferences. Yet the tactical voting paradox highlights that when people anticipate others' strategies, they might feel compelled to vote dishonestly for a better shot at preventing an undesired result. Imagine a small community choosing a new school curriculum. Alice loves curriculum X best, is okay with curriculum Y, and dislikes curriculum Z. If she believes many neighbors support Z, she might decide to rank Y above X, thinking that X might lose outright, so better to back Y to defeat Z in a head-to-head. It's like a sports fan cheering for a rival in a playoff game just to avoid facing a stronger rival later on. The paradox lies in the fact that if everyone does this, the actual best choice might fail miserably despite being the true top pick for many. The phenomenon becomes even more pronounced if certain voters coordinate or guess each other's strategies well, twisting the election into a game of second-guessing rather than an expression of real preferences. This raises a key question. Can a voting system ever truly elicit honest rankings if participants know a bit of cunning might help them more? Understanding the tactical voting paradox emphasizes how quickly sincerity can collapse when people fear an unfavorable outcome. Rather than punishing insincere behavior, some systems practically encourage it, leading to winners who might not actually have the broadest, genuine appeal. It's a reminder that no matter how well we design rules, voters might outsmart them if the system leaves enough room for second-guessing, thereby undermining the process's core mission of revealing what people really want. Misrepresentation paradox. Paradox number 43. If we assume that a voting process faithfully reflects the intensity and order of everyone's preferences, we might be surprised to learn about the misrepresentation paradox, where the final outcome conceals or distorts how the group truly feels. Picture a board of trustees deciding between different long-term plans for a nonprofit. Each member carefully ranks these plans based on factors like cost, impact, and feasibility. Yet the voting method might aggregate those rankings in a way that treats small preference differences the same as large ones or overlooks the possibility that many members share a moderate stance that never rises to first place. It's akin to a polling system that only registers whether you're for or against something, ignoring degrees of support. As a result, a plan that's second choice for nearly everyone but nobody's absolute favorite might get overshadowed by a plan that a small group places first, despite being last for everyone else. This leads to a misrepresentation of where the majority actually stands, giving the impression that the group's decision is more polarized or more unanimous than it really is. The paradox underscores the potential disconnect between the ballots cast and the story those ballots tell once tallied. In real political contexts, it can mean that even a popular compromise candidate gets sidelined if they don't happen to rank first for enough voters. The key lesson is that the details of how votes are translated into a final result matter a great deal. Recognizing the misrepresentation paradox helps us see that while voting is meant to represent us, certain methods can twist or flatten the nuanced texture of our preferences, leaving voters feeling that the final choice doesn't really match what the majority wanted all along. Group manipulation paradox. Paradox number 44. We might think that large groups of voters, all acting independently, ensure a fair and representative result. Yet the group manipulation paradox arises when a coalition of like-minded individuals coordinates their ballots to engineer a specific outcome. Suppose a workforce is using ranked choice voting to select a benefits package. A group that strongly favors package A may realize that if they rank package C first and then a second, they can knock out package B early, anticipating that all B voters will move to C, leaving a clear path to win in the final match. This seems backward. Why would they place a rival package on top? But it's similar to sacrificing a pawn in chess to lure your opponent into a vulnerable position. In a standard scenario, each voter just picks what they like in order, but with careful strategy, a block of voters can distort the tallies by artificially boosting one candidate or plan they never intend to see implemented, thereby eliminating a competitor they consider a bigger threat. This paradox highlights that having many voters doesn't necessarily guarantee honesty or straightforward aggregation of opinions, because people can collectively strategize in powerful ways. It's particularly concerning in elections where dedicated groups have the savvy or resources to coordinate behind the scenes, leaving individual honest voters at a disadvantage. Understanding the group manipulation paradox reminds us that any voting system open to these types of maneuvers might not reflect the majority's genuine wish, as the final outcome is tainted by a carefully orchestrated plan. This prompts tough questions about how to design rules that remain robust even when entire factions decide to game the process. Dual agenda paradox. Paradox number 45. When a group has to vote on multiple issues at once, like a budget for different departments or a package of policies rolled into a single referendum, it seems natural to expect that each issue's outcome would reflect the group's overall preferences. Yet the dual agenda paradox reveals how deciding two or more issues in tandem can produce results that would never emerge if each issue were considered separately. Imagine a legislature that must pass a bill combining education funding and environmental regulations. If lawmakers prefer a certain level of school funding but also have diverse views on pollution controls, bundling them together might force some representatives to accept policies they dislike just to secure part of what they do want. In a separate vote, they might have rejected the environmental measures outright, or vice versa. It's akin to grocery shopping with a roommate where you split costs on both items you love and items you merely tolerate. Because you can't buy them separately, you might end up with a basket of goods that pleases no one fully. This paradox matters because it underlines how multi-issue decisions can prompt strategic horse trading, leading to packages that pass by slim margins yet fail to reflect a true consensus on any individual component. In practice, a group might end up with a result that few genuinely endorse in its entirety, but just enough find parts they can accept. Recognizing the dual agenda paradox helps explain why complicated budget bills or multi-policy referendums can yield outcomes that don't mirror what the electorate would pick if each part were on the table alone. It also underscores that negotiations in such scenarios aren't always about forming a coherent approach, but rather about compromise that may or may not serve the public's best interests in each separate matter. Dominance paradox, paradox number 46. One might expect that if a candidate is clearly worse in every aspect than another, if they're dominated on all criteria, they couldn't possibly come out on top in a fair vote. Yet the dominance paradox shows that under certain voting rules, a candidate who performs poorly against all other contenders in direct comparisons can still emerge victorious. Imagine a situation where candidate D, by almost any measure, loses in one-on-one matchups. They have fewer first-place rankings, weaker second-place support, and less approval overall. Yet, once votes are tallied in a multi-round system with strategic eliminations or unusual transfer rules, D can slip through by virtue of how other candidates knock each other out. It's similar to a sports tournament where an obviously inferior team squeaks past rounds due to flukes in the bracket, eventually claiming the trophy even though they'd lose to many teams if matched head-to-head. The paradox raises a tricky question. How can someone who's inferior by almost every account defeat stronger opponents? The answer lies in the way some voting methods structure eliminations and reassign votes, allowing a subpar candidate to exploit the chaos of transfers or the fragmentation of voter preferences among multiple stronger contenders. Recognizing this possibility is unsettling because it defies the usual idea that a better candidate should always beat a weaker one. If a system can fail to respect direct comparisons, it may lead to an outcome that feels deeply unfair to both voters and the more qualified candidates they actually prefer. The dominance paradox ultimately reminds us that any method ignoring clear head-to-head results or failing to account for dominated choices can produce winners that leave everyone scratching their heads, questioning the system's legitimacy. Reversal symmetry paradox, paradox number 47. If every single voter were to flip their preferences, turning their favorite candidate into their least favorite and vice versa, common sense suggests that the election outcome should reverse. After all, if A was the winner before, then under complete preference reversal, it should become the loser. But the reversal symmetry paradox shows that's not guaranteed. Picture a town council race with 4 contenders, where voter group 1 strongly prefers candidate A over B, B over C, and C over D, while voter group 2 inverts that order entirely. If everyone in the town switches their ballots so that it drops to last for those who had ranked a first, it doesn't necessarily result in a neat flip of the original winner. Maybe the voting system structure for counting and transferring votes means a different candidate emerges victorious for reasons not obvious at first glance, like how the second or third choices get redistributed. It's akin to running a film backward and expecting the scenes to play out in perfect reverse, only to discover that some transitions or cuts distort the story, making it unrecognizable. This paradox highlights a fundamental lack of symmetry in certain tallying rules, undermining our intuitive belief that if you invert every preference, the outcome should also invert. In practical terms, it means that simply reversing the electorates doesn't produce a straightforward opposite result, revealing a hidden layer of complexity in how votes add up and how certain stages of elimination or point allocation might behave. Ultimately, the reversal symmetry paradox underscores how delicate and sometimes counterintuitive the link between collective rankings and final outcomes can be. Strategic entry paradox, paradox number 48. While many assume that adding new voices to an election widens the field of ideas and shouldn't drastically distort who wins, the strategic entry paradox demonstrates how a well-timed or cleverly positioned new candidate can upend the expected outcome. Envision a mayoral race that seems locked between 2 major contenders, candidate X and candidate Y, who hold roughly equal support. Into this contest steps candidate Z, backed by a subset of voters who might otherwise favor candidate X. By drawing just enough votes away from X, Z might enable Y to clinch a majority or at least a plurality. Alternatively, if Z aligns more with Y, then X could benefit from the split in Y's base. It's reminiscent of a surprise guest arriving at a dinner party, causing the other guests to reshuffle where they sit or who they talk to, thereby changing the social dynamics in unexpected ways. Some political operators exploit this paradox by recruiting dummy contenders who have little chance of winning but can siphon votes away from a key rival. That means the mere act of entering an election, sometimes with no real intent to succeed, can swing a result that would otherwise go differently. Recognizing this phenomenon forces us to look closely at whether certain voting rules, like simple plurality, are too vulnerable to strategic entries. It also raises the question of fairness. Should a legitimate contender who draws genuine support be blamed for altering the race? Or is that simply part of a healthy democratic process? The strategic entry paradox reveals that even the act of running for office can be a tactical weapon, undermining the notion that more choices always yield a clearer reflection of voters' will. Opposition amplification paradox, paradox number 49. There's a tempting idea that when a strong candidate faces opposition, the added competition might weaken their chances, but the opposition amplification paradox turns this assumption on its head. Imagine a situation where a popular incumbent faces multiple challengers, some moderate, some more extreme. You'd think the proliferation of opposing voices would split the anti-incumbent vote, actually favoring the incumbent. But under certain voting methods, or with a particular arrangement of second and third choice rankings, those rival challengers can amplify each other's visibility and drive more strategic coalition building against the incumbent. It's like going to a concert where there are several opening acts all better than you'd expect. Rather than drowning each other out, they create a buzz and hype that overshadow the headliner. Perhaps the system redistributes votes in a way that lumps the challenger's supporters together after each elimination, eventually consolidating behind one champion who dethrones the incumbent. Or maybe the multiple challengers force runoffs that highlight the incumbent's vulnerabilities. This paradox matters because it subverts the usual narrative that more rivals automatically drain each other's support. Instead, it shows that a well-orchestrated coalition of new entrants can reinforce the opposition's momentum, a reality both incumbents and reformers need to consider. Ultimately, the opposition amplification paradox tells us that whether added candidates help or hurt the main contender depends on the voting system's design and how those candidates' supporters align, revealing just how delicate the balance of power can be in contested elections. Aggregate intransitivity paradox, paradox number 50. We tend to believe that if all individual voters have sensible, consistent preferences, then the combined result should also be well-ordered. Yet the aggregate intransitivity paradox shows that group decisions can become cyclical or contradictory, even if no single person's ranking is illogical. Imagine 3 policies, B and C, and 3 groups of voters with different preference orders. When you add up these preferences pairwise, you find that A is preferred to B is preferred to C, but C is preferred to A, forming a loop. This is reminiscent of rock, paper, scissors, where rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, and paper beats rock, preventing a clear hierarchy. While such cyclic outcomes sound bizarre, they can arise in real elections, like a city deciding whether to build a new park, library, or sports center, if different factions weigh their priorities differently. That cyclical pattern leaves decision-makers uncertain about which option truly has the mandate. The paradox becomes especially relevant in legislative bodies, where various proposals might pass or fail based on slight shifts in coalitions, despite each proposal being defeated in another matchup. Recognizing this possibility pushes us to question the assumption that rational voters automatically produce rational group outcomes. Instead, it demonstrates that a society of perfectly logical individuals can still arrive at perplexing results when their preferences clash just right. Acknowledging the aggregate intransitivity paradox underscores the difficulty of designing a voting method that can convert diverse opinions into one stable choice without risking circular outcomes that defy common sense. Strategic overcompensation paradox, paradox number 51. When people suspect others might vote strategically, they often overcorrect their own ballots, leading to even more distorted outcomes. A scenario captured by the strategic overcompensation paradox. Imagine a college election where supporters of candidate A anticipate that supporters of candidate B will downrank A to boost their own standing. In response, A's fans might trash candidate B on their own ballots, perhaps putting B last even though they don't genuinely hate B, just to counter B's move. These extreme rankings can end up hurting a compromise candidate C, who otherwise might have emerged as a consensus favorite. It's similar to a family road trip where siblings, expecting each other to hog snacks, overstock their own stash, making the overall journey more chaotic and cramped. The paradox arises because rational players acting in self-defense can escalate the strategic arms race. If you think someone's gaming the system, you game it even harder. As a result, the final tally can reflect huge distortions, far from anyone's honest preferences. This possibility matters because it reminds us that once strategic voting takes root, it may not stop at mild maneuvers. Voters might push their tactics to an extreme, breaking any hope of a fair or authentic outcome. Rather than punishing dishonest ballots, some systems essentially invite this mutual suspicion. Recognizing the strategic overcompensation paradox underscores the need for voting methods robust enough to limit the benefits of manipulative tactics, or at least to reduce the fear that one side's cunning will overshadow everyone else's honest intentions. Variability paradox, paradox number 52. It's common to think that a wide range of voter preferences simply means a diverse electorate. But the variability paradox shows that high variance in individual likes and dislikes can yield an election winner that nobody genuinely expects. Picture a scenario with 5 candidates, each championing a distinct platform. If every voter's set of rankings differs significantly from their neighbors, the results might end up extremely sensitive to minor shifts. One candidate might initially lead, but a small group of strategic voters or late deciding participants could propel another candidate over the top. It's like a classroom experiment where many random inputs lead to surprising group answers on a quiz, even though each student's understanding makes sense on its own. Systems that rely on iterative eliminations, complicated score tallies, or runoff procedures can become erratic when preferences are all over the map. The final result might change drastically with only a tiny fraction of ballots being altered. Some days candidate A wins, other days candidate B wins, and so on, making the notion of a stable will of the people hard to pinpoint. Recognizing the variability paradox is crucial because it highlights the interplay between how scattered or polarized the electorate is and how susceptible the result is to flipping. Even if each voter acts honestly, the sheer diversity of rankings can produce wild, unpredictable outcomes, undermining confidence in the system's ability to mirror the true consensus. This paradox reminds us that the more spread out the preferences, the more carefully the system must be designed to handle that variety without devolving into chaos. Symmetry breaking paradox, paradox number 53. When two or more options seem indistinguishable or equally favored by all voters, it's natural to expect that any vote count would reflect that symmetry, producing a tie. However, the symmetry breaking paradox demonstrates that certain voting methods can split identical options in unexpected ways. For instance, imagine 2 cookie recipes in a bake-off that appear equally popular with the crowd, with both receiving identical average scores and the same distribution of rankings. You'd think they'd tie, but if the method for analyzing tie breaks, rounding certain numbers, or transferring surplus points gives even a microscopic edge to one recipe, that small nudge can compound throughout the process. It's like flipping a fair coin that, due to some subtle manufacturing imperfection, lands heads a fraction more often than tails, eventually showing a strong bias in large samples. In group decisions, a candidate or proposal can become the winner despite being functionally identical to another option, purely because of how a minute advantage got magnified by the vote counting algorithm. This strikes many as bizarre because it violates our intuition that identical cases should yield identical outcomes. The paradox is crucial for revealing hidden biases or asymmetries in seemingly neutral systems. If two candidates are truly indistinguishable, why should one consistently win? Recognizing this puzzle encourages a closer look at every step of the tallying procedure, from how ties are resolved to how votes carry over in multiple rounds. Ultimately, the symmetry-breaking paradox underscores that even symmetrical preferences can produce asymmetrical results, challenging assumptions about fairness when the playing field appears completely level. Critical vote paradox. Paradox number 54. We've all heard about the swing vote in tight elections, where a single voter or small group holds the power to decide an outcome. Yet the critical vote paradox shows that while someone may believe their ballot could tip the scales, the actual structure of many systems can obscure or even negate that effect. Suppose a city council seat is up for grabs, and polling suggests it's neck and neck between two candidates, X and Y. A voter who strongly prefers X might see themselves as the deciding factor if the vote is otherwise tied. In practice, though, if a third candidate Z also runs, or if votes are transferred or tallied in multiple rounds, the exact moment of critical influence can be diluted or shifted to a different stage of the count. It's a bit like thinking you're the final puzzle piece, only to realize there's another puzzle next to yours that changes the whole picture of how the pieces fit. The voter may discover that a tiebreak was decided by some other group's second choices, or that a slightly different turnout altered which votes actually mattered in the final run. The paradox emerges because the simple narrative of one decisive vote doesn't always match the messy reality of many voting systems, especially when elimination orders, surplus redistributions, or multiple candidates muddy the waters. By acknowledging this paradox, we see that while every vote is often presented as potentially pivotal, the precise moment of vote truly counts can be murky. This can either frustrate or relieve voters, depending on their perspective. Ultimately, it reminds us that the power of a single ballot is both vital and yet not always as straightforward or dramatic as popular stories imply. Bridge candidate paradox. Paradox number 55. There's a sense that a candidate who serves as a bridge between opposing factions should be a strong contender, someone who appeals to both sides, fostering compromise. Yet the bridge candidate paradox unfolds when that very position of being in the middle causes them to get overshadowed by polarizing figures. Imagine three political camps, one far left, one far right, and one center. The center candidate, who shares some values with each extreme, might seem like the perfect unifier. In certain voting systems, though, the center candidate can be squeezed out if a series of eliminations favor the loud extremes, especially if each extreme views the center as a mere second choice while passionately ranking their own champion first. It's similar to having a bridging friend in a group who tries to mediate disputes but ends up getting ignored or distrusted by both cliques, never becoming anyone's top ally. The paradox emerges in multi-round or ranking-based methods where being everyone's second pick doesn't necessarily translate to ultimate victory, particularly if a couple of strong, polarized contenders manage to corner first-place votes early. Recognizing this paradox is essential because it challenges the assumption that compromise always finds success in an electoral contest. Instead, it highlights a downside for candidates who aim to span divides. Their broad appeal might also mean lukewarm first-choice rankings that can lead to an early exit. In real-world politics, this can have big consequences, discouraging moderate voices and reinforcing polarization. The bridge candidate paradox thus spotlights a flaw in some tally procedures, where bridging or centrist stances don't always receive the reward one might expect in a truly representative system. Voting power paradox. Paradox number 56. Most of us take for granted that if you have more votes or represent a larger number of people, you naturally wield more power in a group decision. Yet the voting power paradox shows that having a bigger share of votes doesn't always translate into a stronger influence on the final outcome. Imagine a system where votes are weighted based on districts or states. You might think that a district with a larger population would have proportionally greater sway, but certain rules or thresholds can mean that a smaller district, if it sits right on the edge of creating a majority coalition, ends up with an oversized impact. It's reminiscent of a puzzle where moving a single crucial piece can dramatically alter the entire structure, no matter how many other pieces there are on the board. In real politics, consider a legislative body that requires a certain majority to pass a bill. Sometimes the district with fewer voters happens to host a pivotal representative, effectively holding the swing vote needed for legislation to succeed. This can give that smaller district leverage out of proportion to its population. Meanwhile, a larger district, despite having more total votes, might already be so firmly in one camp that it's taken for granted and thus ignored. The paradox comes to life whenever the rules for passing measures or forming winning coalitions create tipping points that smaller groups can dominate. It challenges the idea that one person, one vote automatically leads to fair outcomes, because how votes combine into majorities can matter just as much as how many votes exist. Recognizing this paradox is crucial for debates about redistricting or revising electoral rules, reminding us that even well-intentioned systems can inadvertently reward smaller blocks with a power that's not in line with their actual numbers. When it surfaces in high-stakes decisions, like forming coalition governments or allocating budget resources, voters sometimes feel baffled that the faction they assumed was weaker ends up shaping the result. The voting power paradox thus highlights why no system is purely about raw headcounts. The structure of coalitions and thresholds can turn conventional wisdom about bigger equals stronger upside down, prompting us to look more closely at the ways votes are aggregated and counted. Balance of power paradox, paradox number 57. Most of us figure that in a multi-party or multi-faction system, if one group holds the balance of power, meaning they can make or break a majority coalition, that group will reliably push through its agenda. The balance of power paradox, however, shows that this leverage can backfire in unexpected ways. Suppose you have three parties, B and C. Party A and Party B each control about 40% of the seats, and Party C has just 20%. Because either A or B needs C to form a majority, you'd assume C would get significant concessions from whomever they decide to join. Yet if both A and B worry that bringing C into a coalition will alienate part of their own base, maybe C has some unpopular stances, they might find ways to work together directly or form separate alliances that exclude C. It's a bit like being a small store owner in a market district. You believe that since two bigger stores need your cooperation to organize a big festival, you can name your price, but sometimes the big stores realize they can plan a scaled-down event on their own, leaving you out entirely. The paradox arises when the group holding the decisive slice of seats can't freely extract the benefits it assumes, because the larger factions have alternative paths or simply prefer a compromise that bypasses the smaller group. This can lead to scenarios where the kingmaker remains sidelined, failing to secure meaningful policy wins. It's crucial for understanding coalition politics, where the assumption that a moderate middle faction can always steer the process doesn't always hold. Sometimes that middle faction ends up with less real influence if the other parties figure out ways to cooperate or force a showdown in which the smaller bloc can't risk not joining, effectively reversing the power dynamic. Recognizing the balance of power paradox reminds us that holding the key votes doesn't necessarily guarantee control over outcomes. Coalition formation is a fluid process where large blocs can find workarounds, leaving the smaller ones scrambling to remain relevant. This complicates the idea that being a swing faction automatically translates into outsized power, and it highlights the intricate maneuvers at play in multi-party negotiations. Regret voting paradox, paradox number 58. Many of us have cast a ballot and later wondered if we made the right choice. But the regret voting paradox delves deeper into how individuals can collectively wind up with an outcome nobody truly wanted. Picture a local election with three distinct candidates. Maybe one is pro-business, one is pro-environment, and one is a moderate hoping to bridge the gap. Leading up to the vote, each voter might make a strategic calculation. I prefer the moderate, but I'm worried the pro-business candidate could beat the pro-environment one if I don't lend my support where it's most needed. After the ballots are cast, the pro-business candidate might win, leaving some moderate and pro-environment voters kicking themselves because, had they just voted sincerely for the middle option, it might have topped them both. It's similar to going along with a group decision for dinner, believing you're avoiding a place you really dislike, only to find out that by not advocating for your actual favorite, you got stuck with a restaurant you hate even more. The paradox arises when fear of a disliked alternative causes people to reject their real preferences, culminating in a result that almost nobody genuinely supports. Later, when they swap stories, everyone realizes a simpler, more sincere approach would have produced a more agreeable outcome. In large-scale elections, regret voting can play out when poll-driven or negative campaigning influences voters to play it safe instead of backing their true favorite, collectively handing victory to a polarizing figure. The key takeaway is that while strategic voting might seem rational on an individual level, it can yield a group choice that disappoints the majority once all is said and done. The paradox underscores how the design of voting systems can push voters into second-guessing themselves and ultimately breed collective remorse. By recognizing how easy it is for well-intentioned voters to talk themselves out of voting for their genuine pick, we begin to grasp the complexities of implementing a process that consistently rewards authenticity rather than caution or fear. Focal point paradox. Paradox number 59. There's a belief that in elections, a particularly appealing or distinctive candidate can act as a natural focal point, someone the electorate can rally around. Yet the focal point paradox shows that even a candidate who seems poised to unify everyone can lose out if the voting system or the distribution of second and third choices doesn't align in their favor. Imagine a workplace that needs to pick a single program for skill development. One option is uniquely appealing, combining elements of technical training with leadership development, and you'd expect it to draw people from across different departments. Another option is purely focused on one department's needs, and a third option is trendy but narrowly aimed at management only. You might predict that the well-rounded choice would stand out as the obvious focal point. However, depending on how the voting or ranking works, supporters of each specialized option might strategically place the well-rounded program below their own favorites to ensure it doesn't interfere with their first choice. It's like the main floor at a dance hall that seems ideal for everyone but gets overshadowed if each corner group sets up its own music and lures just enough people to keep the middle section from filling. The paradox arises when the candidate that appears best positioned to command broad support suffers from the fragmentation caused by smaller, more concentrated interests. Even though people might see them as a common ground figure, the actual tallying, especially in ranked or transferable systems, could push them out early if they don't secure enough first-place votes right away. Recognizing this possibility is important because it helps explain why compromise candidates don't always triumph, and why the presence of a strong, natural focal point doesn't guarantee success in a system prone to strategic maneuvers. It underlines the need to consider how votes are aggregated and whether a method might penalize broadly appealing options that don't ignite the same passion as niche ones. Ultimately, the focal point paradox warns us that simply being everyone's second or safe choice may not be enough to secure a win, highlighting yet another subtle complexity in the world of group decision-making. Majority dilemma paradox. Paradox number 60. We often think that if a majority of people favor something, that preference should clearly guide the final outcome. But the majority dilemma paradox illustrates how an internally fractured majority can fail to achieve what it ostensibly wants. Imagine a neighborhood planning committee where over half the residents say they support building a new community pool. However, some support a large, resort-style pool with extensive features, while others prefer a small, budget-friendly pool that won't raise local fees too much. Meanwhile, a committed minority of residents absolutely opposes any new pool due to concerns about noise and upkeep costs. When the time comes to vote on specific proposals, the pro-pool majority splits between the two versions, leaving the no-pool minority to unite behind a single stance. Because of the fractured votes, the proposal for any type of pool might fail, even though well over half the neighborhood wants a pool in principle. It's similar to a bunch of people agreeing to eat pizza for dinner but squabbling over toppings so fiercely that they end up not ordering pizza at all. This paradox highlights how the majority's apparent unity on a broad issue can dissolve when actual options get spelled out, allowing a smaller but tightly focused group to prevail. In voting terms, it underscores that majority rule only works smoothly if the majority can coalesce around one coherent plan. If they can't, The minority might exploit that disunity and effectively block the result that a broad swath of voters supposedly prefer. Understanding the majority dilemma paradox is vital for anyone setting up referendum questions or policy proposals. By not accounting for the nuances within a majority bloc, a system can yield a final choice at odds with what most people initially said they wanted. The paradox thus reveals a chink in the armor of majority rule. Even if more than half the electorate shares a broad goal, the details can drive enough of a wedge among them to let a determined minority carry the day. Voter saturation paradox, paradox number 61. It's a widely held belief that the larger the electorate, the more stable or reliable the results should be, since random quirks might get ironed out by sheer numbers. But the voter saturation paradox suggests that in some voting systems, adding more voters can intensify unexpected outcomes. Envision a national election where a few marginal or safe districts see a spike in turnout for a particular candidate, not because opinions shifted drastically, but because people who typically abstained decide to show up. You might guess that higher turnout would reinforce whichever preference was already dominant. Yet if the system penalizes or redistributes votes in a certain way, that new influx of ballots might nudge a borderline candidate into a better standing, eliminating a strong contender prematurely and tipping the overall result in a surprising direction. It's somewhat like overwatering a plant. Assuming more water is always better, but flooding it can just as easily kill it. The paradox often emerges in methods with multiple rounds or thresholds for viability. A candidate who seemed safely in second place could suddenly be propelled past a crucial benchmark by the new voters, forcing a realignment that unexpectedly weakens another candidate. While we typically champion the idea that higher turnout improves democratic legitimacy, this paradox shows the outcome might become even less aligned with the core preferences of the electorate if the system reacts in odd ways to extra votes. Recognizing this possibility underlines the fact that just having more people participate doesn't guarantee a truer final choice. Sometimes it triggers complicated chain reactions or upsets that leave observers wondering how a stronger mandate ended up delivering an outcome nobody anticipated. The voter saturation paradox, then, is a reminder to scrutinize how ballots are processed and how expansions in participation might influence the sequencing or thresholds in an election, revealing deeper nuances in what we often assume is a straightforward principle: more votes, more representative results. Splitting votes paradox, paradox number 62. We might think it's obvious that splitting a base of support between two very similar candidates will hurt those candidates' overall chances. But the splitting votes paradox shows that this division can sometimes help them, or hurt them in ways we don't expect. Imagine an election with two major parties, each regularly securing close to 50% of the votes, and a new candidate emerges who closely matches the policy platform of one party. Ordinarily, we'd say this new candidate will steal votes from the aligned party, paving the way for the opposing side to win. However, in certain ranked systems or with complicated runoff rules, that new similar candidate might actually make it to a runoff against the established candidate, allowing their supporters to transfer back and forth in a final showdown that shuts out the other side entirely. It's like having two flavors of ice cream, vanilla and chocolate, and introducing double vanilla. If the method of counting or elimination lumps the new flavor in a bracket that keeps chocolate at bay, one of the vanilla options could ultimately triumph in a way they wouldn't have if there'd only been one vanilla choice to begin with. Alternatively, the presence of a clone might simply sabotage the original candidate so thoroughly that neither wins. This paradox underscores the intricacy of how votes are split and how those splits get processed. The bigger lesson is that adding a candidate who's very similar to an existing one doesn't necessarily lead to a straightforward or predictable result. Sometimes it's a spoiler effect that crushes a close contender. Other times it helps one of the twins by restructuring how votes transfer in a runoff. Recognizing this possibility prods us to delve deeper into the counting logic behind each election format, reminding us that splitting votes can produce outcomes that run counter to what naive assumptions about vote splitting would suggest. Ultimately, it reveals yet another dimension in which group decisions can deviate from the simple notion that more similar choices must always weaken each other's standing. Reallocation paradox, paradox number 63. In many ranked choice or multi-round voting systems, votes get reallocated each time a candidate is eliminated, aiming to ensure that no voter's ballot goes to waste. The reallocation paradox happens when this process of passing votes along yields a winner who may not reflect the genuine majority preference once all is said and done. Picture a city election with 4 main contenders, where each round eliminates the lowest performer and redistributes their voters' next choices. Ideally, you'd think this mechanism should reward someone with broad support who consistently appears in second or third place for many ballots, making them a safe fallback. Yet depending on who gets eliminated first, some ballots might transfer in a way that abruptly boosts a candidate who isn't actually that popular in head-to-head matchups. It's akin to reassigning employees in an office after layoffs. You'd hope the good teams remain strong, but sometimes the random shuffle leads to an underperforming department absorbing a few star workers and outshining everyone else. The key is that each reallocation can shift momentum drastically, especially if voter preferences cluster in ways that favor one candidate once others drop out. What makes it paradoxical is that, had the order of elimination been slightly different, or if a handful of ballots had minor preference tweaks, the final result could flip. This reveals the underlying fragility of certain counting methods, where the path to victory matters as much as the final distribution of votes. Understanding the reallocation paradox is critical because it highlights how multiple rounds of transfers, while well-intentioned, can produce odd detours that end up rewarding a candidate who might lose in a straightforward comparison. Recognizing these quirks underscores the broader challenge of designing a voting system that handles eliminations gracefully without inadvertently crowning a candidate most voters wouldn't pick if given a direct head-to-head choice. Equal representation paradox, paradox number 64. It seems like a straightforward goal: ensure every voter is represented equally, so that each individual's voice has the same impact. But the equal representation paradox arises when you try to perfectly balance representation across geographic or demographic lines and find that the result still leaves some people feeling underrepresented. For instance, suppose a country draws districts so meticulously that each one contains exactly the same number of residents, ensuring each district weighs the same in the legislature. That sounds fair on paper. Yet if one district's population is diverse and has vastly different political views, it might elect a centrist candidate that hardly aligns with any strong preference, whereas another district with a more homogeneous population might easily rally behind a clear choice. It's a bit like slicing a pie into identical pieces by area, yet one slice might have all the extra fruit, making it sweeter, while another slice is mostly crust. So even though the slices look equal, people end up with quite different experiences of the dessert. In voting contexts, the equal representation ideal can be undermined by countless real-world factors: where people live, how parties cluster, and how demographic groups intersect with district boundaries. Moreover, a system that tries to correct for these imbalances, perhaps by implementing complex proportional formulas, might introduce other forms of paradox or strategic manipulation. Recognizing the equal representation paradox reminds us that simply ensuring each district has the same population, or each vote theoretically carries the same weight, doesn't guarantee satisfaction or fairness in practice. Genuine equality often proves slippery because cultural, economic, and ideological divisions don't map neatly onto uniformly sized segments of land or groups of people. The paradox essentially warns that the noble aim of equalizing representation is easier said than done, as even the most carefully crafted boundaries and seat distributions can fail to capture the true diversity or intensity of voters' preferences, sometimes leaving communities feeling as though their voices still aren't heard. Threshold paradox, paradox number 65. Many voting systems employ thresholds, like a minimum percentage of votes a party needs to enter parliament, to prevent fragmentation or keep out very minor factions. The threshold paradox appears when these thresholds produce seat distributions that clash with our sense of fairness or logic. Imagine a proportional representation system where a party must get at least 5% of the vote to earn seats. If one party gets 4.9%, they end up with 0 seats, despite being just a few votes shy of 5%. Meanwhile, a party with exactly 5% might secure several seats, effectively amplifying a tiny additional sliver of voter support. It's like a theme park ride that requires visitors to be at least 48 inches tall. A child who's 47.9 inches is barred, while a child just barely 48 inches can ride freely, even though their abilities and experiences might be nearly identical. This disconnect can grow worse when multiple parties hover around the threshold, creating dramatic swings in seat allocation over minuscule shifts in vote shares. Sometimes, supporters of a borderline party are torn between casting a sincere vote and choosing a safer alternative to ensure they don't waste their ballot if their preferred party fails to hit 5%. That strategic dilemma can distort overall results even more. The paradox is important because it illustrates a double bind. Thresholds aim to maintain stable governance by avoiding too many tiny parties, but they can also disenfranchise a significant slice of voters who end up unrepresented. Recognizing the threshold paradox forces us to grapple with how sharp cutoffs in electoral systems can seem harsh or arbitrary, privileging one fraction of the electorate while ignoring another group that's nearly as large. It's a reminder that every rule meant to keep elections more manageable, be it a threshold, a quorum, or a viability requirement, has side effects that might counter the broader goal of accurately translating votes into seats. Voter discrepancy paradox, paradox number 66. Sometimes, elections don't just hinge on who shows up, but also on how intensely different groups feel about the issues. The voter discrepancy paradox arises when this intensity gap collides with a voting system that doesn't fully account for how deeply voters care about their choices. Picture a scenario where candidate A's supporters are lukewarm but numerous, while candidate B's supporters are fewer in number but passionately committed. You might assume that because A has more total backers, A should win. However, if the voting method allows or even encourages strategic maneuvers, like weighting certain preferences more heavily or mobilizing turnout among diehard fans, B can still claim victory. It's similar to planning a potluck where half the guests feel mildly positive about having salads, but the other half is absolutely fervent about bringing homemade pizza. Even though salads might be acceptable to more people, the pizza enthusiasts could end up controlling the menu if they're vocal and organized in how they cast their votes for dinner options. This paradox highlights the difference between the breadth of support and the depth of support, and how certain designs can inadvertently amplify the voices of a smaller but more dedicated group. At times, that's not necessarily unfair. Intensity of preference can be an important factor. Yet if the system fails to treat moderate support as meaningful, you can wind up with a winner that a large share of voters don't strongly favor. Understanding the voter discrepancy paradox pushes us to ask whether voting methods should consider not just how many people like a candidate, but also how strongly they feel. It also prompts a closer look at whether the drive to reward energetic supporters ignores those who might prefer a more consensus-based outcome. Ultimately, this paradox reminds us that measuring preferences can be tricky when some groups care just enough to vote but not enough to outmaneuver those who view the election with intense passion and well-honed strategies. Margin distortion paradox, paradox number 67, we're taught that if a candidate wins by a wide margin, it's a clearer mandate than if they scrape by. Yet the margin distortion paradox warns us that the final tally might not reflect how close or lopsided the race really was. Suppose an election uses a ranked choice system where votes are transferred from eliminated contenders. Even if candidate X is only slightly more preferred than candidate Y, a small edge in early rounds might lead to a snowball effect. As other candidates drop out, their votes transfer in ways that greatly inflate X's lead, culminating in a final margin that looks decisive. It's akin to a sports tournament where a team that barely wins its first match benefits from the bracket structure, facing weaker opponents and building momentum to claim an overwhelming victory in the final. On paper, it seems they dominated the entire tournament, even though one bounce early on could have knocked them out. This paradox also appears in plurality systems if voter turnout or minor candidate spoilers shift the playing field enough to widen a gap artificially. The inflated margin can mislead observers into thinking the electorate was overwhelmingly united behind the victor. when in reality the difference was razor-thin at a critical point in the process. By spotlighting how certain methods can magnify small leads, the margin distortion paradox questions the assumption that a big victory margin automatically signals unanimous support. It suggests we examine whether certain structural features, like sequential elimination, unrepresentative turnout patterns, or strategic voting, are exaggerating differences that, at the bottom, might be minor. Understanding this paradox is vital for interpreting elections responsibly. A large spread in the final count doesn't always mean the race was truly one-sided, and policy decisions made on the assumption of a sweeping mandate might not align with the nuanced reality of voter preferences. Representation Index Paradox, paradox number 68. In efforts to measure how well electoral outcomes mirror voter preferences, some propose a representation index or other numeric gauge. At first glance, these formulas seem like objective ways to check if each group gets its fair share of seats or influence. However, the representation index paradox appears when such metrics yield results that contradict people's intuitive sense of fairness. Imagine you have two regions. Region 1 is large but politically diverse, and Region 2 is smaller but more homogeneous. A strict formula might show that Region 1's elected officials exactly match the proportion of votes cast by each subgroup, while Region 2 appears slightly underrepresented. Yet if you talk to residents on the ground, Region 2 might genuinely feel more satisfied because their narrower range of views is cleanly reflected by a single representative, whereas Region 1's official breakdown, though mathematically precise, leaves many voices feeling overlooked. It's a bit like analyzing the quality of a family vacation using a spreadsheet of hours spent at different attractions. You might find everyone got an equal share, but that doesn't mean all family members actually enjoyed what they did during their slice of time. The paradox arises because a representation index can account for certain factors, like seat proportions, while ignoring real-world dynamics such as whether elected officials truly engage their constituents or whether minority opinions are effectively heard. In some cases, the index can even reward systems that appear to distribute seats fairly, but bury dissenting voices within large, complicated coalitions. Recognizing this paradox compels us to ask if a numeric measure can ever fully capture the complex reality of representation. While these indices can provide helpful clues, relying on them blindly risks misunderstanding how people actually experience political power. That gap between statistics and lived experience is the representation index paradox in action, reminding us that fairness is not just about neat fractions but also about whether individuals feel recognized and empowered in the decisions that affect them. Composite voting paradox, paradox number 69. Mixing different voting systems, like combining score voting with ranked preferences or layering a primary plus runoff approach, can feel like a way to capture the best of multiple methods. Yet the composite voting paradox reveals that merging two or more systems sometimes produces odd or contradictory outcomes. Consider an organization that first uses approval voting to shortlist candidates. Each member can approve any number of contenders, and then switches to a Condorcet-style runoff to pick the final winner. You might expect the latter phase to simply refine the shortlist, but the tension between how approvals are counted and how pairwise matchups are decided can skew which candidates make it to the runoff. A candidate who garners lots of approval votes but loses narrowly in head-to-head comparisons could be eliminated prematurely, even if, by a different measure, they'd stand a good chance of winning. It's reminiscent of trying to blend two distinct recipes, like a cake batter and a pie filling, and discovering that the combined dish bakes into something unexpectedly bitter or rubbery. Each system has its own assumptions about what constitutes a good winner, and layering them can create a method that satisfies none of those assumptions clearly. The paradox arises when the final outcome fails to match what either system alone might have produced, occasionally leading to a candidate who isn't strongly preferred by any subset of the electorate. By illuminating this risk, the composite voting paradox prompts a more careful design of hybrid electoral rules. Rather than assume we can simply stitch together different fair methods to get a super fair result, it suggests that the seams where these methods intersect can introduce distortions. The takeaway is that combining voting rules isn't guaranteed to combine their strengths. It may compound their weaknesses instead, leaving voters puzzled and possibly undermining faith in the process. Aggregate utility paradox. Paradox number 70. Many philosophers and economists suggest that the best choice is the one that maximizes overall happiness or utility. You'd think that if everyone assigns a numerical utility to each option, the winner should be the one with the highest total or average score. The aggregate utility paradox, however, points out that this method can still clash with common ideas of fairness or majority rule. Picture a vote on how to spend local funds. Option A spreads benefits broadly, giving moderate value to a large number of residents, while option B intensely benefits a smaller group but leaves others with minimal or no gain. If the smaller group's satisfaction is so high that their combined utility surpasses the moderate sum from the rest, they might come out on top in a purely additive sense. But the majority, which receives at least some positive value from A, might be outvoted by the raw utility calculation. It's akin to awarding a single mega prize to one lucky winner in a raffle while everyone else gets nothing on paper. The total utility could be big for that one person, but it leaves the rest feeling overlooked. This paradox underscores the tension between maximizing total happiness and distributing it in a way that feels just or democratic. It also reveals that aggregating utilities can be tricky because individuals measure satisfaction differently and might not directly compare their well-being to others. Recognizing the aggregate utility paradox helps us see why certain high-intensity preferences could overshadow broader, mild preferences, even if the latter represent a majority. In essence, it forces a choice. Do we prioritize the sum of all contentment, or do we ensure the majority doesn't feel sidelined? That dilemma persists in everything from local budgets to national policy, highlighting the challenge of merging utilitarian logic with the principles of majority-led democracy. Preference aggregation paradox. Paradox number 71. Collecting everyone's ranked preferences might seem like the purest form of democracy. If we just gather all the votes accurately, we'll discover the group's real will. The preference aggregation paradox reminds us it's not so simple. Suppose each voter's personal ranking is consistent and logical on its own, yet when you add them all together, the collective ranking can end up cyclical or self-contradictory, a phenomenon reminiscent of the famed Condorcet cycles. Imagine 3 possible vacation spots, with distinct sets of travelers each holding different preference orders. Though no traveler is confused about what they want, the group as a whole might prefer spot A over spot B over spot C, but then bizarrely prefer spot C over spot A, forming a loop. It's like trying to fold several maps into one master guide. Each is valid, but combined, they refuse to align neatly without overlaps or gaps. What makes this paradox so striking is that every individual preference is rational, yet the sum of them is not. The contradiction arises because methods of aggregation, no matter how carefully designed, must reconcile conflicting orders in a single outcome. Arrow's impossibility theorem famously formalizes one aspect of this. No voting system can satisfy all fairness criteria simultaneously. The preference aggregation paradox highlights the day-to-day manifestation of that result, where good faith attempts to gather and unify different opinions sometimes produce an impossible puzzle. It underscores why no single method or formula can guarantee a perfect reflection of group will, and it challenges our expectation that fair plus fair plus fair must yield a uniformly fair solution. By confronting this paradox, we learn that group decisions inherently involve trade-offs and complexities that defy a neat, all-encompassing formula. Normative conflict paradox. Paradox number 72. In trying to design fair elections, we often rely on certain norms, protect minority rights, reflect the majority's voice, allow for diverse options, and promote stability. Yet the normative conflict paradox arises when these well-intentioned norms clash so directly that it's impossible to honor them all. For instance, a voting system might aim to give every voter equal influence, equality, ensure that the final outcome can't be reversed by introducing a spoiler, stability, and guarantee that a strong majority preference always prevails, majoritarianism. But forcing a system to meet all three can result in built-in contradictions. One criterion's fulfillment might sabotage another. It's akin to a parent telling a child to finish their homework, get enough rest, and have fun all in the same evening. In principle, these are all good guidelines, but in practice, balancing them might be impossible. Different cultures or political contexts weigh these norms differently, leading to a patchwork of electoral rules that reflect local priorities. Sometimes a society values stability so highly it's willing to accept some inequality, or it prizes majority rules so strongly it neglects minority voices. The paradox emerges whenever we expect a single system to perfectly juggle all moral, practical, and political imperatives. Understanding the normative conflict paradox reminds us that good design involves deciding which norms to emphasize and which to compromise. It also explains why reforms can be contentious. Pushing for more of one ideal, like robust representation of every small faction, can undercut another, like governmental decisiveness. Ultimately, this paradox forces us to recognize that fairness in voting isn't just a technical puzzle but a normative balancing act. By acknowledging these tensions, we approach electoral design with more realism, accepting that no method can perfectly satisfy every laudable goal at once. Strategic projection paradox. Paradox number 73. Election outcomes aren't determined merely by voters casting sincere ballots. They also hinge on how people anticipate each other's behavior, a phenomenon sometimes leading to the strategic projection paradox. Imagine a crowded mayoral race where supporters of candidate A worry that if everyone else lumps behind candidate B or candidate C, their honest vote for A might be wasted. They start second-guessing. If my neighbors pick B, I should switch to B so we can block C. While others think, if my neighbors pick C, I'd better back C to stop B. These swirling assumptions can cause a cascade of strategic ballots that distort the genuine distribution of preferences. It's similar to a stock market scenario where investors try to predict each other's trades, resulting in self-fulfilling prophecies or sudden panics that deviate from a stock's true value. In a voting context, entire blocks might mobilize around an option they see as having momentum, not necessarily the one they genuinely love, or they might desert a candidate they truly favor if they believe others have already abandoned that ship. The paradox kicks in when this mutual projection pushes the electorate to converge on a winner who might have been a second or third choice for many, someone who wouldn't have topped the tally if everyone voted sincerely. Moreover, the problem intensifies if the race is close, with poll data fueling more speculation. Understanding the strategic projection paradox is crucial because it reveals the psychological interplay that can overshadow direct policy comparisons or personal ideals. Far from being minor tactics, these projections can reshape an entire election, prompting the question, is the final winner truly the most popular, or just the one people believed everyone else would pick? By shedding light on how mass expectations steer votes, this paradox reminds us that designing a system to minimize second-guessing is no small feat. Collective rationality paradox. Paradox number 74. We tend to assume that if all individuals in a group act rationally, choosing what's best for them given the information at hand, then the group's combined choice should also be rational or at least consistent. The collective rationality paradox counters that assumption, demonstrating how individually sensible choices can yield a collectively irrational or inconsistent result. Picture a town deciding on a schedule for a public facility. Each resident picks the hours they personally need, making perfect sense from their standpoint. But when those hours are aggregated, it might create chaotic or overlapping demands that no one truly intended. It's akin to everyone in a group trying to arrive at a dinner party at the optimal time, only to jam up the driveway when they all show up simultaneously. In more formal terms, frameworks like game theory show us how rational players can collectively generate outcomes that are suboptimal for everyone involved. Classic examples include the prisoner's dilemma, where mutual defection yields a worse outcome than mutual cooperation. This paradox also surfaces in voting. If each faction logically backs its own candidate, or if individuals cast strategic ballots to block a worse outcome, the final winner might not represent the group's best interest in a direct, straightforward sense. Recognizing the collective rationality paradox matters because it highlights the gap between individual and collective logic. Even with perfect information, groups can end up with decisions that none of their members would have chosen if they'd coordinated differently. That gap is what underlies many paradoxes in social choice theory. It reminds us that the step from personal preference to group policy is never automatic. How those preferences interact can spark counterintuitive results. By grappling with this paradox, we learn to see rational behavior as context-dependent, and we appreciate why so many voting rules and negotiations aim to encourage cooperation or compromise rather than mere individual optimization. Dual-level voting paradox, paradox number 75. In some systems, decisions happen across multiple tiers, local, regional, and national, for instance, under the impression that each level accurately represents its population before joining forces in a larger assembly. The dual-level voting paradox surfaces when the way votes are aggregated across these layers produces a final result that no single layer would have chosen on its own. Imagine a federal structure where local councils elect delegates, who then convene to pick a national leader. In each council, a majority might prefer candidate A, and thus delegates are instructed to support A at the national level. But the delegates could operate under a different set of procedural rules there, perhaps forming coalitions or alliances that shift toward candidate B in a runoff or second ballot. It's akin to puzzle pieces that each contain a consistent picture, yet when you try to assemble them, you end up with an image that fits together but doesn't resemble any of the smaller pictures. Alternatively, a regional caucus might send a block of delegates to the higher-level vote who believe they must compromise with another region's delegates, collectively abandoning the very candidate their home voters favored. This disconnect reveals how the hierarchical structure can reshape outcomes, sometimes leaving local constituents puzzled or frustrated by national results that don't reflect the straightforward will of the lower tiers. The paradox underscores that layering votes doesn't simply add up in a linear way. Each level's unique processes can transform or dilute preferences along the chain. By recognizing the dual-level voting paradox, we see that multi-tier systems demand careful design to ensure that representation at one level translates reliably into representation at the next. Failing to do so can result in a final choice that perplexes or alienates voters who assumed their voice at the local stage would reverberate faithfully at higher stages, only to discover it got lost or significantly altered. Systematic bias paradox, paradox number 76. Many people assume that while no voting system is flawless, any bias in the process emerges randomly, affecting all candidates equally over time. Yet the systematic bias paradox shows that certain rules can repeatedly favor or penalize specific types of candidates. Imagine a city that always uses a particular ranked choice method. Over several elections, you notice a pattern. Populist or polarizing figures consistently outperform compromise candidates, even if surveys show the latter have broader overall appeal. It's a bit like a casino game that's officially fair but has a subtle edge built into its design, one that, in practice, leads to consistent house wins. In voting, the house might be a particular style of candidate who's adapted to exploit the system's quirks, such as rounding rules, elimination orders, or how tie-breaks work. Voters end up perplexed because the results look legitimate on the surface. Everyone cast their ballots, and the counting was transparent. But hidden in the mechanics is a tilt that rewards candidates who strongly mobilize a core group of fans while systematically overlooking the mild support a broader candidate might have. Over multiple contests, these systematic biases can profoundly shape who chooses to run. Potential moderates may decide there's little point in competing if the system is stacked against them. This is especially concerning when the same type of candidate keeps winning, making voters wonder whether the outcome truly reflects shifting public sentiment or just the structure's favoritism. Recognizing the systematic bias paradox helps us realize that neutral voting methods aren't always truly neutral. Sometimes, a seemingly small detail, like how eliminated votes get transferred or how ties are resolved, can push the system to favor certain contenders election after election. It underscores that studying past election data might reveal a consistent pattern of winners who align with the system's biases rather than the electorate's evolving will. Ultimately, this paradox underscores the need to question assumptions about fairness. If a process repeatedly yields the same kind of winner, it may not be a coincidence, but a sign that the system's inherent tilt is shaping the democratic landscape more than the voters themselves. Electoral surprise paradox, paradox number 77. It's one thing to expect a close race and see a candidate inch forward, but the electoral surprise paradox arises when a result defies nearly all predictions, catching the public off guard in a big way. Picture a high-profile election where polls and analysts give one candidate a comfortable lead. On election night, however, results flip dramatically, with a dark horse contender pulling off a shocking upset. Initially, people might suspect polling errors or last-minute scandal. Yet the real cause could lie in how votes are tallied, perhaps a ranked choice mechanism that systematically eliminates the expected frontrunner too early, or an oddly configured district map that clusters their supporters in a handful of districts, leaving them overrepresented in a few places but wholly underrepresented in the rest. It's similar to watching a weather forecast that calls for sunny skies, only to experience a sudden hailstorm. The underlying system, meteorological models or electoral rules, might have hidden complexities that weren't factored into the straightforward prediction. This paradox matters because it erodes public trust. Voters see a stark contrast between what they were led to believe and what actually happens, leading to accusations that the system is rigged or that the electorate changed their minds en masse at the 11th hour. Neither might be true. Instead, the structural quirks that few understand can produce an outcome that feels random or deeply counterintuitive, even if each vote was honestly cast. Often, the electoral surprise ignites debates about whether the rules should be reformed to provide more transparent, predictable results, or whether unpredictability is simply a feature of democracy that keeps all sides on their toes. In either case, recognizing this paradox means accepting that elections can behave like complex systems, where small shifts or overlooked factors cascade into monumental surprises. It reminds us that logic and polls can fail to capture the full picture when a voting method's less obvious mechanics come into play, producing a winner no one seriously saw coming. Utility discontinuity paradox, paradox number 78. People often talk about voter utility, a way to measure how satisfied or dissatisfied each person is with a certain outcome. If we assume each voter has a smooth, continuous preference scale, we might think small differences in preferences lead to small changes in the final result. Yet the utility discontinuity paradox shows that tiny shifts in how voters rank or score options can cause massive jumps in who wins. Imagine you're using score voting, giving each candidate a score from 0 to 10. A handful of voters adjust their scores just slightly, maybe dropping a favorite candidate from a 9 to an 8 while nudging another from a 7 to a 7.5. You'd expect the overall tally to move a bit, but nothing major. However, if these small changes cross a crucial threshold, like a cutoff that determines who gets eliminated or who surpasses the average needed to stay in the race, an entirely different winner might emerge. It's like gently tapping a precariously balanced bookshelf. You only exert a minor force, but the entire structure collapses in a cascade. This discontinuity is problematic because it conflicts with our intuition that voting outcomes should reflect a stable reflection of what people want. Voters can feel blindsided when subtle alterations to their ballots, or the ballots of a tiny subset, trigger a drastic upheaval in results. In high-stakes scenarios, clever campaign operatives can exploit this by encouraging precise micromanagement of scores or ranks, effectively orchestrating dramatic changes without needing a broad-based shift in the electorate. Recognizing the utility discontinuity paradox suggests a sobering truth. Even an apparently continuous metric like scoring can hide abrupt fault lines where candidates' prospects rise or fall in ways that defy gradual, predictable trends. It also underscores that small margin of victory can be a misleading phrase, since the margin might represent a sharp cliff rather than a gentle slope. Ultimately, the paradox pushes us to ask whether a voting method can be truly fair if such discontinuities are built in, and if there are ways to cushion or smooth out these abrupt flips to better mirror real voter sentiment. Choice set expansion paradox, paradox number 79. In theory, adding more options to a decision should never hurt the existing choices. People can simply ignore the new ones if they don't want them. The choice set expansion paradox, however, indicates that expanding the list of candidates or proposals sometimes shifts the outcome in puzzling ways. Imagine a corporate board selecting a new software vendor. They have two strong contenders, vendor A and vendor B. Then a third candidate, vendor C, appears with a very similar offering to vendor B. Because of how the voting method aggregates preferences or conducts eliminations, this addition might siphon enough second-place support from B that A ends up winning comfortably, even though in a two-option comparison, B might have beaten A. It's reminiscent of a restaurant menu where a newly introduced dish competes with one of the older ones because they share common ingredients, diverting orders from that particular entree, and ironically boosting sales of a completely different dish that now stands out as the unique alternative. This paradox resonates most strongly in systems that aren't strictly one-person, one-vote with simple majorities, such as ranked choice or multi-round elimination methods. Expanding the choice set can trigger complexities in how preferences get redistributed or how final tallies calculate. Instead of broadening democracy, it can inadvertently spoil a candidate or produce a cyclical problem. Recognizing the choice set expansion paradox is crucial when designing elections or decision processes that attempt to be inclusive, allowing many options to surface. While inclusivity is a laudable goal, these unexpected shifts highlight the need for caution. Just because we add more options doesn't mean we're guaranteed a more representative outcome. In fact, the final decision might drift further from what voters would pick if confronted with fewer alternatives. Ultimately, the paradox reveals another layer of vulnerability in how group preferences get tallied. Sometimes more choice seems beneficial, yet it tangles up preferences in ways that deliver a winner who thrives not because they're loved, but because the competition got divided or rearranged by the extra addition. Order reversal paradox, paradox number 80. We tend to think that presenting choices in a different order shouldn't radically alter who people ultimately pick, especially if their underlying preferences remain the same. The order reversal paradox challenges this assumption, demonstrating that rearranging the sequence or the way questions are posed can fundamentally shift an election's result. Suppose a committee is voting on a series of proposals by pitting them pairwise, with the winner moving on to face the next challenger. If the initial matchup is between proposal X and Y, and X wins, it might then go on to defeat Z in the next round. However, if the order is reversed, starting with Y versus Z, Z might come out on top, setting up a scenario where X is eventually knocked out. You end up with two totally different winners, even though the committee members' preferences never changed. It's somewhat like a bracket-style sports tournament where the top seed can get upset early by a middle seed they never would have faced if the schedule was arranged differently. This paradox is crucial for understanding why agenda-setting powers, like deciding which proposals get voted on first, can drastically shape outcomes. A chairperson with influence over the voting sequence can manipulate the path to favor their preferred choice, effectively guiding certain contenders to face matchups they're more likely to win. Even in simpler systems, something as small as how candidates are listed on a ballot can sway results, if certain psychological biases lead voters to pick the first name they recognize. Recognizing the order reversal paradox is a reminder that the progression of an election can be just as important as the content of people's votes. Even if each decision step seems fair on its own, the overall sequence might not reflect what the group would choose if they saw all options at once. Ultimately, it underscores the fragility of a process where the order in which questions or contenders are presented can overshadow the electorate's broader consensus, adding another dimension to the complexities of designing a foolproof voting system. Plurality voting paradox, paradox number 81. Plurality voting, where everyone selects a single candidate and the one with the most votes wins, is among the simplest and most common methods used worldwide. Yet the plurality voting paradox arises when a candidate without majority support ends up winning, potentially sidestepping a candidate that a majority of people actually prefer. Suppose a three-way race includes candidate A, candidate B, and candidate C. If A captures 40% of the votes, B gets 35%, and C gets 25%, it can win outright, even though 60% of voters, B and C supporters, might strongly dislike A. It's like a group of friends deciding where to eat by each shouting one restaurant name, with the loudest voice winning, even if most friends actually prefer a different option. The paradox grows more striking if B and C are similar, splitting a large block of voters, while A is distinct enough to seize a narrow but unchallenged plurality. This can push the electorate to think strategically, leading some to abandon their true first choice in favor of a candidate more likely to beat the disliked frontrunner. Critics argue this paradox is central to why plurality systems foster a two-party mentality. Nobody wants to waste a vote on a third candidate who can't muster a majority. In practice, that dynamic discourages new voices and stifles meaningful choice, as voters align with the lesser of two evils. Awareness of the plurality voting paradox is key to understanding why many reformers advocate ranked choice or runoff systems, hoping to ensure that a winner commands broader support. Yet the fix isn't always straightforward. Some alternative methods bring their own quirks and paradoxes. Still, the fundamental concern remains. Plurality can produce winners who lack real majority backing. Recognizing this feeds debates about whether the simplest voting rule is inherently the fairest, or whether it systematically marginalizes alternative viewpoints and, in extreme cases, hands victory to a polarizing candidate who's truly disliked by most. Runoff system paradox, paradox number 82, runoff elections, where the top two finishers in an initial round face each other in a final vote, are touted as solutions to the problems of plurality voting. Yet the runoff system paradox appears when those two rounds interact in unexpected ways, potentially excluding the candidate who'd actually be most favored in a direct comparison. Picture a three-candidate race with A, B, and C. In the first round, A narrowly edges out C, while B sails into first place. That means the runoff is B versus A, and B wins. However, if C had beaten A in the first round by a slim margin, maybe the final showdown would be B versus C, one that C might win if the majority of A's supporters dislike B strongly enough to switch to C. It's reminiscent of a round-robin sports scenario where a team that could outscore the favorite never gets the chance to face them because they're knocked out in an unlucky opening match. This paradox frustrates voters who realize that the candidate they truly prefer might never appear in the final if the initial round happens to break unfavorably. It also encourages strategic voting. If your favorite candidate is neck and neck with another contender for second place, you might downplay a preference for a more popular candidate in hopes of ensuring your candidate gets into the runoff. Even if runoff systems are designed to promote majority support for the ultimate winner, small tweaks in that initial round's vote distribution can produce drastically different finalists. The paradox underscores the potential fragility of multi-stage methods. Simply having a second round doesn't guarantee the best head-to-head match occurs or that the truly most popular choice emerges. While runoffs might eliminate some problems inherent in pure plurality voting, they aren't immune to their own brand of unexpected outcomes, where the system structure can keep a winnable matchup from ever taking place. Weighting factor paradox, paradox number 83. In certain electoral processes, each voter's ballot might carry a different weight, perhaps because they represent different-sized regions or groups, under the assumption that it balances representation. The weighting factor paradox emerges when these carefully assigned weights produce skewed or contradictory results. Suppose a national council aims to ensure rural regions aren't overshadowed by big cities, so rural votes weigh 1.5 times those of urban voters. That might seem fair if rural areas otherwise risk being ignored. Yet consider a close vote. A rural region with fewer total voters might effectively outmuscle a large city. It's like adjusting the brightness on one lamp so a second lamp isn't completely outshone, inadvertently making the room feel unbalanced. This paradox grows more acute if multiple weighting factors stack. Say one region is given extra weight for geographical reasons, another for historical disenfranchisement, and so on, until the layered adjustments create a system where a minority viewpoint prevails. Critics argue that while weighting can address real inequities, it can also inflate some voices beyond what feels legitimate. Alternatively, weighting might be so mild that it doesn't actually fix the original problem, leaving those meant to be protected still feeling underrepresented. And in legislative bodies, weighting occasionally leads to bizarre coalition formation, where a small bloc with high-value votes extracts outsized concessions. Recognizing the weighting factor paradox underscores that any attempt to correct for unfair distributions can overshoot or produce fresh imbalances. It prompts the question, how do we systematically adjust vote values without creating new forms of distortion? In practical politics, heated debates arise when certain districts or states seem to have more clout per voter, sparking calls for reform or even constitutional challenges. The paradox is that the same mechanism designed to protect minority interests can wind up distorting the collective will more severely than if everyone's votes counted equally. It reminds us that while weighting can be an appealing shortcut to representation, no method is free from trade-offs, and the balancing act can quickly tilt into a whole new form of disparity. Cumulative voting paradox, paradox number 84. Cumulative voting allows each voter to allocate multiple votes to one or more candidates, intending to give minority groups a better chance of electing at least one representative. Yet the cumulative voting paradox arises when this flexibility triggers unintended consequences. Imagine a 5-seat election where a particular group forms about 30% of the population, enough to claim 1 or even 2 seats if they concentrate their votes effectively. If these voters split their votes among different minority-friendly candidates, though, they might spread themselves too thin and fail to elect anyone. Conversely, if the group's leaders coordinate perfectly, placing all votes behind 1 or 2 candidates, they might exceed their fair share, leaving the other seats to the majority with little competition. It's similar to distributing resources among several projects. If you spread them evenly, you might underfund everything. If you focus too narrowly, you might succeed in a small corner but lose out elsewhere. The paradox becomes even more pronounced when multiple minority factions each attempt strategic vote allocation. If they guess incorrectly about how other groups will behave, they can either over-concentrate their votes or spread them out, missing the sweet spot. Observers sometimes see outcomes where a seemingly large minority bloc gains less representation than smaller, better organized blocs. This raises questions about whether cumulative voting actually provides a fairer platform or just a new playing field for strategic manipulation. Recognizing this paradox is crucial for communities hoping that cumulative voting will resolve issues of underrepresentation. While it's an improvement for some contexts, the method can also reward savvy alliances or punishes those who don't coordinate precisely. Voters might feel confused or pressured to vote according to a scheme rather than their true preferences. Ultimately, the cumulative voting paradox reminds us that giving voters more ways to distribute votes doesn't automatically guarantee fairer outcomes, especially when groups vary in how effectively they strategize. It highlights the deeper theme of social choice theory. Each new approach to balancing representation can introduce its own set of paradoxical results. Sequential elimination paradox, paradox number 85. At first glance, deciding an election step by step, removing the weakest candidate and redistributing their votes until only one remains, seems like a straightforward approach. However, the sequential elimination paradox arises when the particular sequence of eliminations leads to a winner who wouldn't prevail if all choices were evaluated together. Picture 4 contenders, B, C, and D, vying for a city council seat. Depending on how initial tallies shake out, the weakest candidate in the first round might differ by just a handful of votes. If candidate A is knocked out early, their supporters' next preferences could catapult C into the final head-to-head, defeating B in the end. Yet if a tiny shift in first-round ballots causes B to trail slightly behind A instead, B gets eliminated first, and the subsequent transfers might help A or D instead. Suddenly the entire outcome flips, even though hardly anything changed about people's rankings. It's akin to a line of dominoes arranged in branches. Knocking over the first tile on one branch leads to a completely different pathway of falling tiles than starting on another. The paradox is particularly glaring when you realize that if you'd compared B and C directly at the start, maybe B would have won comfortably, but the sequential process never let them face each other under the right conditions. This dynamic pushes voters toward strategic maneuvers, like artificially boosting or lowering certain candidates in hopes of controlling who gets eliminated first. It also gives enormous weight to small pockets of votes that decide the initial margin. Recognizing the sequential elimination paradox is key to understanding how multi-round elections can drift from what might be called a true consensus. Even if each round seems logical, drop the weakest candidate, reassign their voters' next choices. The overall journey might favor whichever candidate is lucky enough to navigate the early stages in just the right order. In a larger sense, it reinforces the lesson that the path an election takes, who's eliminated, and by how many votes, can be just as important as the final matchup. Randomized tie-breaking paradox, paradox number 86. In many voting rules, ties happen. Perhaps two candidates end up with the same number of votes, or a complex rank choice tally puts them on equal footing. A natural fallback is to break this tie by chance, such as flipping a coin or drawing lots. Yet the randomized tie-breaking paradox appears when such a seemingly fair, impartial method produces results that stray far from the electorate's genuine wishes. Picture a tight mayoral race in which candidate A and candidate B finish tied. A coin toss anoints B as the winner. While at first this might seem an innocuous solution, consider that another small contingent of voters, had they changed their second or third choices only slightly, might have given a decisive lead. The knowledge that luck, rather than policy differences, decided the outcome can leave voters feeling that the entire process was undermined by a quirk of fate. Additionally, awareness of a random tiebreak can spark strategic behavior, where factions engineer exact tie scenarios to gamble on a 50-50 shot, rather than risk falling behind if the tie is broken by yet another method. It's analogous to letting a coin toss decide which child gets more slices of pizza. While it's neutral, it can ignore who's genuinely hungrier or whether there was a fair way to split portions. Recognizing this paradox reveals a stark truth. Randomness, though impartial, doesn't always produce a result that aligns with the deeper preferences of the group. In some systems, it may even encourage last-minute vote shifting to force ties. The key takeaway is that while tie-breaking by lot feels like a small procedural detail, it can tilt an election's outcome in a surprising and sometimes destabilizing way. Even something as seemingly minor as a coin toss can have large psychological and practical impacts when the stakes are high, reminding us that every aspect of a voting system, even how it handles razor-thin margins, plays into perceptions of legitimacy and fairness. Opposition consensus paradox, paradox number 87. Sometimes, you'd think that if multiple opposition groups all agree on the same broad goal, say, to remove an unpopular incumbent, they'd unite behind a single challenger. Yet the opposition consensus paradox emerges when those groups, despite sharing a common enemy, fail to coordinate effectively and inadvertently enable the incumbent to retain power. Imagine three parties, each vehemently against the sitting mayor, each convinced its own candidate is the best bet for reform. Because none of them is willing to concede to a unifying figure, votes get split among the three challengers, while the incumbent sails through with a modest plurality. It's like a group of friends who all want to watch a new movie but can't settle on which streaming service to use, so they end up not watching it at all. In certain ranked or runoff systems, this paradox can manifest in more nuanced ways. The opposition parties might half-heartedly encourage strategic voting, but subtle differences in how their supporters rank secondary preferences can end up favoring the incumbent anyway. Alternatively, an opposition coalition might overcorrect by uniting behind a compromise candidate who fails to excite any group sufficiently, losing momentum and pushing voters back to the incumbent out of sheer familiarity. The paradox highlights a unique twist. Having a shared adversary doesn't automatically forge actual cooperation, especially if each faction believes it can do better on its own. Observers often blame ego or short-term thinking, but it's also a structural problem of how votes are tallied. The system may not adequately reward partial coalitions or compromise slates if those alliances come together too late or in too loose a manner. The opposition consensus paradox thus underscores that a common dislike of the incumbent can still fracture the opposition, resulting in an outcome that nobody in that majority truly wanted, yet couldn't avoid because they never managed to pool their support effectively. Iterative voting paradox, paradox number 88. Some organizations experiment with iterative voting, where ballots are cast in multiple rounds, with new information revealed after each round, hoping that voters adjust their choices to converge on a consensus. But the iterative voting paradox arises when these repeated rounds lead to oscillations or unexpected final outcomes that defy what a single decisive vote might have produced. Imagine an online community polling its members on a new feature rollout. In each round, users see the partial results, possibly changing their votes in response to what's leading or trailing. While the intent is to let people refine their preferences based on collective feedback, the system can spiral into strategic behavior, where certain users keep flipping their votes to manipulate momentum, or others overreact to a fleeting lead by switching sides. It's similar to an auction where bidders keep outbidding each other by small increments, unaware of everyone else's final willingness to pay, sometimes overshooting or undershooting the actual value. In some cases, iterative rounds never settle if factions keep toggling between choices once they see how the tally is evolving. In other cases, the final outcome might be drastically different from a poll of sincere, one-time preferences, because voters end up gaming the rounds to shape a strategic equilibrium. While iterative voting aims to refine consensus, it can ironically produce more volatility and less transparency about what people genuinely want. This paradox highlights how feedback loops in a voting process, though intended to nudge participants toward common ground, can instead amplify partial shifts and panic moves. It's a reminder that even well-meaning attempts to incorporate real-time learning into elections risk harnessing herd psychology or strategic pivoting, creating results that feel arbitrary. Understanding the iterative voting paradox encourages caution in adopting multi-round feedback-driven methods unless careful safeguards prevent endless flip-flops or manipulative behavior that undermines the goal of a sincere group decision. Coalition realignment paradox, paradox number 89. We often assume that once voter blocs or parties form a coalition, they remain allies through the election cycle. However, the coalition realignment paradox demonstrates that seemingly stable alliances can abruptly shift if the voting system or strategic incentives change midstream. Envision a parliamentary system where two parties join forces to push out the long-dominant party O. They campaign together, pool resources, and share a platform. But as the final election approaches, new polling data suggests that if M can peel off just enough of N's supporters, M might secure an outright majority without N's help. Sensing this, M adjusts its campaign to subtly undercut N, triggering a last-minute meltdown in the alliance. Meanwhile, N's voter base, feeling betrayed, might defect to O or split in a way that inadvertently boosts O. In the end, O either retains or regains power despite being generally less popular than the combined MN bloc. It's a bit like two hikers teaming up to climb a mountain, until one sees a quicker route to the summit and abandons the partner on a precarious ledge. The paradox emerges from the tension between short-term unity and the possibility that a small advantage can tilt the balance of power. Depending on the system, be it plurality, ranked choice, or proportional representation with thresholds, parties might recalculate the payoff for coalition membership at the 11th hour. This can produce jolting realignments that not only surprise voters but also disrupt conventional wisdom about who stands where on the political spectrum. Recognizing the coalition realignment paradox sheds light on why alliances that look rock-solid sometimes fracture dramatically, leaving observers wondering how a weaker party slipped back into control. In the bigger picture, it underscores the precarious interplay between cooperative strategies and the ever-present lure of going it alone if the system's dynamics suddenly make that choice more profitable. Voting distribution paradox, paradox number 90. We typically expect that if groups of voters are unevenly spread out, like concentrated in certain regions or scattered across different areas. This might affect seat allocation but not the fundamental fairness of the overall result. The voting distribution paradox, however, points out that where and how votes cluster can reshape who wins in surprising ways. Take a country with two main parties, each having equal nationwide support of about 50%. If Party A's voters happen to be narrowly packed into certain districts, while Party B's are more evenly distributed, Party B might capture a disproportionate number of seats. It's a bit like two soccer teams with equally talented players. If Team A always places its best strikers together on the field, they might dominate one area but leave the rest open to attacks. Sometimes, the paradox results from deliberate gerrymandering, redrawing boundaries to cluster or disperse the opposition's supporters. Other times, it arises from demographic happenstance, where like-minded people naturally settle in the same place. Because many electoral systems allocate representation by discrete geographic areas, the patterns of distribution can overshadow raw vote counts. Even at a smaller level, like a condo association vote, if owners who strongly favor a particular improvement live in just a few blocks, they could be outvoted by a spread-out majority that's less passionate but numerically superior across multiple buildings. Recognizing this paradox is crucial for addressing whether seat counts truly reflect overall voter sentiment. It questions the assumption that simply adding up votes across regions is enough, because the shape or makeup of those regions can overshadow what the pure proportion of support suggests. At its core, the voting distribution paradox urges us to consider not just how many people hold certain views, but also where they reside and how votes translate into discrete seats or outcomes, underscoring another layer of complexity in designing fair representation. Redistricting paradox, paradox number 91. Redistricting, the process of redrawing electoral boundaries, might seem a routine technical task. But the redistricting paradox arises when minor boundary changes flip winners and losers in ways that appear disproportionate or manipulative. Envision a state carved into 10 districts. Party X leads 55% to 45% statewide, yet after a redistricting plan, Party Y somehow wins more seats because X's voters are now segmented in a way that wastes their majority in super-concentrated districts while Y spreads its supporters more evenly. It's much like rearranging store shelves so that a popular product is hidden in a back corner, ensuring people either can't find it easily or end up buying less out of frustration. Critics often scream gerrymandering when they see such radical swings. But the paradox isn't always due to intentional malice. Sometimes benign boundary shifts to account for population changes produce similar distortions. Even if everyone votes exactly as before, the distribution of seats can change drastically because representation is linked to how lines are drawn. Observers might question how a 55% statewide majority can result in a seat minority, or vice versa. This undermines confidence in elections, sparking calls for independent commissions or algorithmic redistricting that minimize shapes that cluster certain voter blocks too neatly. Yet even the best-intentioned map can yield awkward results if communities are clustered in ways that favor one party. The redistricting paradox is an ever-present reminder that in a system where seats are geographically anchored, geometry can overrule demographics. It urges us to treat districting as a critical component of fairness, not just a mundane procedural matter, because the location of those lines can effectively tilt the political playing field, no matter how the votes themselves are cast. Strategic misrepresentation paradox, paradox number 92. Voters won elections to reflect their true preferences, but the strategic misrepresentation paradox shows that honesty isn't always the best policy under certain rules. Suppose a ranked choice system encourages you to list your true favorite first. However, if your favorite is perceived as a long shot, placing them at the top might guarantee they get eliminated early. Instead, you might elevate a more viable candidate you find acceptable, ensuring that your ballot doesn't go to waste in the critical late stages. It's the electoral equivalent of a job seeker padding a resume with skills they don't genuinely possess, hoping to pass an initial screen. Collectively, if enough people downgrade their real favorite out of fear it won't win, a consensus candidate with moderate support might end up on top, despite being nobody's true first choice. The paradox becomes especially stark in systems that heavily penalize fringe candidates or rely on thresholds for viability. Ironically, a candidate who could catch on if all supporters voted sincerely might never gain traction because too many supporters worry about wasting their ballot. This leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy where the candidate remains non-viable purely due to strategic exaggeration or downgrading by the very people who like them. The effect is magnified if polls or media coverage accentuate who's a frontrunner, further pressuring voters to misrepresent. Recognizing this paradox clarifies why some elections feel stuck in a two-option rut, with imaginative or unconventional voices drowned out by strategic calculus. While ranked systems aim to grant more nuanced expression, they can still push voters into hedging tactics. Ultimately, the strategic misrepresentation paradox highlights the tension between what people truly want and what they believe can actually win, warning that certain rules do more to foster strategic illusions than reveal raw preferences. Intensity of preference paradox, paradox number 93. We often assume that if a large majority says they prefer one candidate over another, that candidate should clearly prevail. But the intensity of preference paradox emerges when a smaller group's fierce passion can outweigh a larger group's mild support in certain voting methods. Imagine a school board deciding on a policy. 60% of parents favor a moderate approach but only mildly care about it, while 40% are absolutely devoted to a more extreme stance. If the voting system accounts for the depth of feeling, perhaps through approval scores, weighted ranking, or extra credit for strongly favorable ratings, the passionate minority may push their option over the top. It's like planning a group outing where most people say they'd be okay with a nice picnic, but a vocal, enthusiastic minority insists on a theme park trip, invests more energy in campaigning, and ends up convincing the group to go on roller coasters instead. While some might argue this acknowledges real-world differences in how intensely people care, others view it as letting a smaller faction impose its will if the system structurally amplifies their fervor. The paradox reminds us that balancing majority rule with the reality of preference intensity is never straightforward. Democracy typically counts votes, not degrees of passion, yet ignoring intensity might lead to a tyranny of the mild majority. Recognizing the intensity of preference paradox calls attention to the trade-offs in weighting or measuring how strongly someone feels. If a method overvalues intensity, smaller groups can hijack decisions. If it never accounts for intensity, majorities with tepid interest may pass decisions that severely harm a dedicated minority. This puzzle is central to debates on whether voting should remain purely numeric or incorporate measures like preference strength, opening up a deep conversation on fairness, representation, and the complexity of people's beliefs. Fairness criterion paradox, paradox number 94. Many voting system analysts formulate fairness criteria, like consistency, monotonicity, or the majority criterion, and judge methods by how many they satisfy. The fairness criterion paradox surfaces when fulfilling one standard forces a system to break another, leaving no way to satisfy them all. Arrow's impossibility theorem is the most famous expression of this, but similar trade-offs appear in simpler contexts. Think of a method that prioritizes majority rule, ensuring that if a candidate is preferred by more than half of voters, that candidate always wins. That might sound obviously fair, yet it can fail other criteria like the Condorcet property, where a candidate who beats every rival in head-to-head matchups should win, if the voting method's design is prone to strategic manipulation or cyclical group preferences. Alternatively, a system that tries to be immune to manipulation might end up ignoring clear majorities in certain scenarios. It's akin to a parent trying to enforce consistent bedtimes, healthy meals, and plenty of free play for children, only to realize fulfilling all three to the letter is impossible. Meeting one norm might undercut the others. In elections, each fairness principle, like no favorite betrayal or participation should never hurt, demands specific mechanisms that can come into conflict. This paradox underscores why no single, flawless method exists. Every rule we regard as fair eventually collides with another in some scenario. Recognizing it helps keep expectations realistic and fosters an informed debate about which values matter most in a given context. Maybe you prioritize preventing spoilers above all else. Or maybe you'd rather preserve majority rule at the cost of allowing some strategic voting. Either way, the fairness criterion paradox highlights the need to pick our battles among the many laudable aims we might want a voting method to achieve. Aggregate rationality paradox, paradox number 95. If each voter is a rational agent with coherent preferences, it stands to reason that combining their votes should yield a collective choice that's also rational. The aggregate rationality paradox shows this needn't happen. Group outcomes can appear cyclical, contradictory, or otherwise irrational despite every individual's sensible ranking. One famous illustration is the Condorcet cycle, where A is preferred to B is preferred to C, and yet C is preferred to A in pairwise comparisons, a loop that no single person's ballot reflects. It's much like a puzzle in which each piece is correctly shaped, but they refuse to form a unified picture when put together. The root cause lies in how preferences aggregate, synergy, compromise, and strategic incentives can reshape the final outcome into something that satisfies no one's original logic. Social choice theory widely acknowledges this phenomenon, proving that certain fairness or rationality principles cannot all coexist. Voters may be internally consistent, but the group mind can still get tangled if the voting method can't process those preferences without distortions. This paradox often arises in legislative bodies where majority coalitions shift depending on which bill is on the table, creating seemingly erratic policy outcomes. It highlights that rational individuals is not enough to ensure a rational collective, especially when different ways of counting or framing votes create complex interactions. Coming to grips with the aggregate rationality paradox leads to a humbling realization. Democracy cannot always mirror pure logic in its results. Sometimes, the best we can hope for is a system that, despite its imperfections, consistently channels a broad range of opinions without producing outright chaos. The paradox thereby underscores a fundamental tension in group decision-making. Even when each participant is perfectly rational, the combined effect may not be, reminding us how essential it is to scrutinize the methods we use to sum our voices. Equal opportunity paradox, paradox number 96. It's natural to assume that if everyone has the same chance to participate in a voting process, the outcomes should automatically be fair. Yet the equal opportunity paradox highlights how even when the rules ostensibly treat every voter identically, certain structural quirks in the system can skew representation. Imagine a country where each citizen receives exactly one ballot, cast in a uniform way, and where each region is assigned seats based on population so that no single district is either over or underrepresented on paper. You might expect that as long as everyone can vote without barriers, you'll capture the true will of the people. However, subtle factors may still tilt the playing field. Maybe in some regions, socioeconomic conditions depress turnout for a particular group, or gerrymandered district lines, though equal in population, cluster politically like-minded voters in ways that dilute or magnify certain voices. It's a bit like distributing the same high-quality seed to every farmer but ignoring drastically different soil conditions. One farmer harvests a bumper crop, while another struggles to grow anything. The paradox emerges most starkly in places with safe districts or stark urban-rural divides, where the official rules are neutral, yet the actual distribution of preferences and resources leads to clear, repeated advantages for one faction. These unexpected distortions may leave some voters feeling unheard or deter potential candidates whose communities rarely see success, despite everyone seemingly having an equal shot. In the end, the equal opportunity paradox shows that a set of procedural guarantees, like identical ballots and seat apportionment, doesn't necessarily create a level field if other contextual factors skew participation and outcomes. It reminds us that real fairness isn't only about ensuring no formal barriers exist. It also requires us to look deeper into whether each person's vote truly has the same practical impact on shaping the final decision. Hierarchical voting paradox, paradox number 97. Most large organizations break decisions down into smaller units, local branches, regional councils, then a national body, under the assumption that each tier's choices will flow upward neatly. The hierarchical voting paradox arises when the bottom-up results merge at a higher level to produce outcomes that contradict what the majority within each tier actually supported. Picture a corporation where local offices elect delegates to a regional board, which in turn selects representatives for a central committee that makes the final call on major policy. At the local level, maybe each branch agrees wholeheartedly on pushing for policy A. Yet once these delegates reach the regional stage, negotiations with other branches might push them to a middle ground policy B. Then, at the final central committee, delegates from multiple regions rehash their compromises, potentially ending up with policy C, one that hardly anyone in any local office truly wanted. It's akin to a game of telephone, where each retelling of the message alters its content, so the final statement no longer resembles the original. This paradox can puzzle stakeholders who wonder how so many local majorities and regional preferences somehow morph into a baffling final outcome. The culprit often lies in the rules for each tier, like supermajority requirements, strategic alliances, or the way delegates are mandated to vote as a bloc, but might shift positions if a more enticing trade emerges. By the time decisions funnel up to the highest level, the original preferences that seemed robust at each rung may be watered down or swapped out. Recognizing the hierarchical voting paradox is essential for anyone involved in multi-tier governance or federated organizations, as it highlights the fragile journey from local consensus to a final edict. Even if every step appears fair, the path taken can flip or dilute those early preferences, prompting calls for more direct or uniform ways of capturing each tier's true will. Index inversion paradox, paradox number 98. Many political scientists and mathematicians try to measure a candidate's power or centrality in an election by developing indices that rank contenders based on factors like how many head-to-head matchups they win or how often they're placed first across various voter groups. It seems straightforward that if candidate A holds a stronger index score than candidate B, A should likely beat B in the actual vote. The index inversion paradox, however, shows that a candidate who ranks higher on one or multiple power indices can still lose in a real contest. Imagine an approval voting index that measures how many voters find each candidate acceptable, side by side with a separate tally that looks at pairwise comparisons. A contender might top both these metrics. Virtually every voter can tolerate them, and they tend to prevail in hypothetical one-on-one duels. Yet they still fail under the final counting method if their support isn't intense enough to outshine a rival's fanatically loyal base. It's reminiscent of a sports team dominating in statistical categories like total yardage or shots on goal but still losing the match because they couldn't convert those attempts into actual points. This paradox frustrates reformers who point to these indices as evidence of which candidates truly hold broad appeal, only to watch a narrower, more polarized candidate come out on top in the official result. It's not necessarily that the indices are wrong. They can reveal valuable insights about how a candidate stands. Rather, the gulf arises from the specific election rules that transform raw preferences into a final outcome. Recognizing the index inversion paradox invites caution when we interpret these analytical tools. Even if data suggests that a candidate is strong or most likely to unify, that status can vanish once ballots enter a system with its own constraints and quirks. The paradox underlines that while indices try to capture certain ideals of popularity or dominance, the actual rules of counting can upend those assessments, leaving data-driven predictions or endorsements seeming hollow. Dual-stage voting paradox, paradox number 99. Some believe that splitting an election into two distinct stages can combine the best of both worlds, a preliminary round to narrow down the field, followed by a final showdown to confirm the majority's preference. Yet the dual-stage voting paradox emerges when this very separation blocks a candidate or option that might have triumphed in a single, unified process. Imagine a primary election where Party X picks its nominee first, while Party Y waits until later to finalize theirs. By the time Y announces its candidate, the public mood might have shifted, or the X nominee might have locked up endorsements and momentum from swing voters who decided early. Conversely, if Y's primary occurs first, it could sway which candidates from X even bother to run. The outcome in the general election can thus hinge on these timing quirks, and a candidate with broad appeal might never get off the ground if they're bumped out of the race at the wrong stage. It's a bit like deciding half a dinner menu in the morning and the other half at night. By the time you pick the remaining dishes, earlier choices might predetermine how the meal tastes overall. Alternatively, a two-stage structure could invite or deter certain voters from participating in preliminary rounds, skewing the sample that moves forward. Reformers sometimes champion multi-stage voting for clarity or to weed out weak contenders. Yet the paradox shows that chunking the decision process can lose a candidate who might have outpolled everyone else in a single-round method. It also paves the way for strategic maneuvers, such as propping up fringe rivals in the early stage to undermine a strong threat. Recognizing the dual-stage voting paradox prompts a fresh look at whether we gain anything by dividing elections into phases. While it can clarify choices and give voters a second chance, it also runs the risk of funneling the race into outcomes that don't align with the electorate's holistic set of preferences, reminding us that how we sequence votes can be as crucial as the votes themselves. Overlapping district paradox. Paradox number 100. When two electoral districts or zones share certain territory or voters, you'd expect that their separate decisions wouldn't conflict too dramatically, especially if they're partially drawing on the same pool of people. Yet the overlapping district paradox arises when the same voters' preferences add up to contradictory or puzzling results across these overlapping regions. Imagine a metropolitan area split into a city council district and a county board district that partially covers the city, so some residents vote in both. In one election, they choose a council member from among local candidates they feel best understand urban issues, while in the other, the same residents might side with a county-level candidate who has a more regional focus. Though the same electorate is involved, the aggregated outcome can champion opposing platforms, even direct policy clashes, because the mix of additional county voters or the narrower city scope changes how preferences get weighted. It's much like a film being jointly produced by two studios. The shared budget might lead them to approve a certain actor in one context, but in a broader context with different stakeholders, the very same actor might be rejected for the lead role. This paradox highlights how partial overlaps can produce inconsistent policy mandates, leaving officials scrambling to reconcile conflicting directives from essentially the same population. It gets even more complicated if one district's voters can tip the balance in a wide region, while the rest of that region has different needs or politics. Recognizing the overlapping district paradox underscores that democracy isn't just about how people vote, but also about who gets grouped together in each election, and the fact that being part of multiple districts can fragment a single voter's overall set of preferences. The overlap can create surprising divides or alliances that wouldn't appear if each district were wholly distinct or entirely unified, illustrating yet another quirk in how representation can twist and turn once we start slicing up maps in complex ways.